Welcome, my dear listener. Tonight, I shall tell you of an age when the world was young, and the stars were closer to men's hearts. I have walked through many empires in my long years, dear listener, and witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations that believed themselves eternal. But few experiments in human history were as audacious, as contradictory, as profoundly world-changing as the union of Soviet Socialist republics. Tonight, I invite you to journey with me through the everyday existence of those who lived behind what the West called the Iron Curtain, not as distant observers, but as if we ourselves had awakened in a communal apartment in Leningrad, breathed the cold morning air of Moscow, felt the texture of black bread between our fingers, and heard the distant hum of factory machinery that never ceased its mechanical song. I remember the Soviet Union not as the gray monolith of Western cinema, though there was grayness aplenty, but as something far more complex, a tapestry woven from threads of genuine idealism and brutal repression, technological marvel and chronic shortage, collective spirit and profound loneliness. It was a place where neighbors shared bathrooms with 7 other families, yet found ways to create private moments of beauty, where workers built rockets that touched the stars while standing in line for hours to purchase oranges, where children recited oaths to Lenin while their parents whispered different truths around kitchen tables late at night. The morning I wish to recall for you begins in December of 1922, when the Soviet Union was officially born from the ashes of revolution and civil war. The Russian Empire had fallen, the Tsar and his family had met their tragic end, and Vladimir Lenin stood at the helm of something unprecedented, the world's first socialist state built upon the theories of Karl Marx and adapted to Russian soil. The very name spoke of grand ambitions, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, where Soviet meant council, democratic assemblies of workers and peasants who would govern themselves. Socialists proclaimed that the state would own all means of production, ending the exploitation of the working class. And unions suggested a federation of equal republics, though this equality would prove more adherence than reality. I recall the bitter cold of those early years when the new state struggled to find its footing. The Civil War had devastated the countryside. Millions had perished from violence, disease, and famine. Cities stood half empty, their populations having fled to villages in search of food. The industrial base that Russia had begun to build before the Great War lay in ruins, machinery silent, workers scattered. Yet, among the rubble, there burned a fierce determination, a belief that humanity could be remade, that a new kind of person could emerge, the new Soviet man, unselfish, collectively minded, devoted to building socialism. Lenin himself was an enigmatic figure, a brilliant theorist who had spent years in exile, studying, writing, planning for the moment when revolution would be possible. He believed that Russia, despite being largely agricultural and backwards compared to the industrialized West, could leapfrog history itself through the leadership of a disciplined revolutionary party. This party, the Communist Party, would serve as the vanguard of the proletariat, guiding the working class toward their destiny. It was a beautiful theory in its way, promising liberation from exploitation and want. But theory, as I have learned across the centuries, often collides painfully with the complexities of human nature and the hunger for power. The structure of the new state reflected these competing visions. Lenin had imagined a decentralized federation where the various Soviet republics, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Caucasian territories, The Central Asian lands would maintain considerable autonomy over their own affairs, bound together by shared socialist principles. But Joseph Stalin, the Georgian who had risen through the party ranks through a combination of administrative skill and ruthless elimination of rivals, envisioned something quite different. He saw the need for iron centralization, for Moscow to command and the periphery to obey, for Russia to dominate and the other republics to follow. The constitution adopted in January of 1924 preserved the appearance of federation, the illusion of republican independence. Each Soviet Socialist republic had its own government, its own symbols, its own nominal sovereignty. The Union flag bore the hammer and sickle symbols of workers and peasants, united against a red background that spoke of revolutionary sacrifice. But beneath these symbols, power flowed from a single source: the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, headquartered in Moscow, in the ancient fortress complex called the Kremlin, where once Tsars had ruled and now general secretaries commanded. I watched as this party became not merely a political organization, but the skeleton upon which the entire society was built. It was codified as the leading and guiding force of Soviet society, the nucleus of the political system, the only legal party in what became the world's first one-party state. To rise in Soviet society, to gain access to privilege, to shape one's destiny, one needed to navigate the party's structures, to understand its unwritten rules, to cultivate connections with those who held power. The party operated as a kind of feudal hierarchy, though its members would have bristled at the comparison. When a new leader ascended, he brought with him his own people, his trusted associates who had proven their loyalty during his rise. These individuals would be placed in key positions throughout the bureaucracy, and they in turn would select their own subordinates, creating networks of patronage that bound the system together through personal obligation rather than abstract ideology. The Russians had a word for this ruling class, the nomenklatura, perhaps 500,000 souls during the later years, whose positions required approval by relevant party agencies. These were the elite, who enjoyed privileges that set them apart from ordinary citizens: access to closed shops, stocked with goods unavailable elsewhere, comfortable apartments in the best buildings, weekend houses called dochas in the countryside superior, medical care, foreign travel. But the party's reach extended far beyond this elite. It created what theorists called transmission belts, mass organizations through which ordinary citizens were drawn into participation in Soviet political life. The Komsomol, the youth organization for those aged 14 to 28, enrolled millions of young people, teaching them the language of socialism, organizing their leisure activities, monitoring their ideological development. For younger children, there were the pioneers, with their red scarves and solemn oaths. For workers, there were trade unions, though these bore little resemblance to Western labor organizations, serving instead to mobilize workers for production goals and to distribute various benefits. For women, there were the Gensovieti, the women's councils. Through these organizations, Soviet citizens learned to speak the official language, to mouth the proper phrases, to demonstrate correct consciousness. Yet I have always found it remarkable how people can participate in such rituals while maintaining private reservations, how they can recite the expected words while thinking forbidden thoughts, how they can live simultaneously in official and unofficial worlds. This dual consciousness would become one of the defining features of Soviet life. A psychological adaptation that allowed individuals to navigate the demands of the collective state while preserving some core of authentic selfhood. The economic system that emerged in these early years would shape every aspect of daily life for the 7 decades that followed. The Bolsheviks had inherited an economy devastated by war and revolution, and they faced a fundamental choice: how to organize production and distribution in a socialist society. The answer they arrived at was central planning, a system in which the state would own all significant means of production, and a central authority would determine what should be produced, in what quantities, and how resources should be allocated. Beginning in 1928, the Soviet economy was guided by a series of 5-year plans, ambitious programs that set targets for every sector of the economy. These plans reflected both the genuine desire to modernize Russia and a profound mistrust of the capitalist world, which Soviet leaders believed would inevitably seek to destroy the socialist experiment. The memory of foreign intervention during the Civil War, when British, French, American, and Japanese forces had supported the White armies against the Reds, burned deeply in Soviet consciousness. The conviction that war would come again drove an obsession with rapid industrialization, particularly in heavy industry that could produce weapons and machinery. I recall the feverish energy of those first 5-year plans, when the entire nation seemed to be under construction. New cities rose from empty steppe, vast hydroelectric dams harnessed Siberian rivers, steel mills and coal mines and tractor factories emerged where previously there had been only villages. The human cost was staggering. Millions of peasants were forcibly relocated from the countryside to work in these new industrial complexes, often living in appalling conditions, working long hours for meager pay. Yet the growth was real. Between 1928 and 1940, the Soviet economy grew by nearly 6% annually, almost doubling in size. At the very moment when the capitalist world was experiencing the catastrophic economic collapse of the Great Depression. This achievement was not lost on observers in the West, some of whom began to wonder whether perhaps the Soviet system had found a better way. What they often failed to see was the nature of this growth, built upon forced extraction of resources from the countryside, upon the labor of millions who had little choice but to comply, upon a system that prioritized quantity over quality, production targets over human welfare. The Soviet industrial model relied upon what economists call extensive growth, increasing output not by improving efficiency or technology, but simply by adding more inputs: build more steel mills, hire more workers, mine more coal, cut more timber. In the short term, when you are starting from a low base, this approach can produce impressive numbers. A country that had been primarily agricultural could indeed be transformed into an industrial power within a generation. But the model contained the seeds of its own eventual stagnation. For there are limits to how many resources can be mobilized, how many workers can be recruited, how many hours can be extracted from exhausted laborers. Yet in these early years, the problems lay hidden beneath the impressive statistics, the new factories, the rising production figures. The Soviet Union seemed to be racing toward a future that gleamed with promise, a workers' paradise where exploitation would end and abundance would be shared equally. The propaganda posters of the era captured this optimism. Muscular workers with hammers raised, peasant women with sheaves of wheat, children with red scarves gazing toward distant horizons, all bathed in the golden light of the socialist dawn. But I, who have seen many dawns and many false promises, I noticed even then the shadows that accompanied this light. I saw the faces of the peasants being forced into collective farms, their private plots of land seized, their traditional ways of life destroyed. I heard the whispers about those who disappeared in the night, arrested by the secret police for crimes of thought or association. I sensed the fear that was beginning to permeate Soviet society, the knowledge that one careless word, one moment of insufficient enthusiasm, one denunciation by a jealous neighbor or ambitious colleague could lead to catastrophe. My morning light that I recall from those early years of the Soviet Union was thus tinged with both hope and dread, illuminating a vast experiment in remaking human society, an experiment that would touch the lives of hundreds of millions of people, that would shape the course of the 20th century, that would leave legacies both inspiring and horrifying that endure to this day. Come with me now, dear listener, as we step deeper into this world, as we explore not merely the grand political theories and economic systems, but the texture of daily life, the morning routines, the work rhythms, the small pleasures and constant frustrations, the public performances and private truths of ordinary people who lived through this extraordinary time. Chapter 2. The texture of morning in a communal world. The light of dawn filtered weakly through a frosted window in Leningrad, and I recall awakening with the household, not in a home of one's own, but in a single room within what had once been a grand apartment, now subdivided and occupied by 8 separate families. This was the kommunalka, the communal apartment, and for millions of Soviet citizens across the decades, it would be the primary experience of home. Picture, if you will, a pre-revolutionary building that had once housed a single wealthy merchant family and their servants. High ceilings with decorative moldings, parquet floors that had once gleamed, tall windows that looked out upon a street lined with similar buildings. After the revolution, when private property was abolished and housing was redistributed according to need, such apartments were divided. Each family received a single room, determined by a formula based on the number of occupants and their social status. Workers and party members received priority. Former members of the bourgeoisie, if they were allowed to remain in the cities at all, might find themselves crowded into the smallest spaces. The result was a form of living that challenged every notion of privacy that we might take for granted. The bathroom, a single toilet, a bathtub with uncertain hot water, a cracked sink, was shared among all the families. The kitchen contained a stove with multiple burners, each family having their designated cooking times and their own shelves in the communal refrigerator, carefully labeled to prevent accusations of theft. The long corridor connecting all the rooms became a public space where children played, where adults encountered each other, coming and going, where the sounds and smells of 8 separate lives mingled into a cacophony that never completely ceased. I remember the strategic planning required for the simplest morning rituals. To use the bathroom, one needed to time one's arising carefully. Too early, and the space would be frigid, the water possibly frozen in the pipes during the harshest winter months. Too late, and a queue would form, neighbors waiting with varying degrees of patience, some angry, some resigned, all aware that this situation was permanent, not temporary, that there would be no moving to better circumstances unless one received official permission, unless one's workplace allocated a new apartment, unless one cultivated the right connections or demonstrated exceptional service to the state. The sounds of morning in a kommunalka were distinctive and impossible to ignore. The clatter of pots as someone prepared tea, The splash of water as another family filled a basin for washing, the creak of bed frames and the shuffle of slippered feet on worn parquet, the arguments, sometimes fierce, sometimes weary, about whose turn it was to clean the shared spaces, about who had used more than their allotted cooking time, about a child who had been too loud the previous evening. The walls were thick in these old buildings, remnants of an era when construction was solid and materials were abundant, but the doors were thin, and sound traveled in strange ways, so that one could hear snippets of conversation from neighboring rooms, the cry of an infant, the cough of an elderly person, the late-night return of someone who worked the evening shift. Within each family's single room, life compressed itself into a carefully organized space. A bed that folded or converted into seating during the day, a small table for meals and homework, shelves and hooks for clothing, for there were rarely closets, and space was too precious to waste on furniture. Personal possessions were minimal by necessity, a few changes of clothes, essential documents kept carefully protected, perhaps some books, a photograph or two, treasured items from before the revolution, or received as special gifts. Everything had its place, and disorder was not merely aesthetically displeasing, but practically catastrophic in such tight quarters. The morning routine included preparation of tea, that essential Russian beverage that provided warmth and comfort regardless of one's circumstances. If a family was fortunate enough to possess a samovar, a traditional Russian tea urn, it might be set up in their room, though officially such electric devices were often prohibited due to concerns about overtaxing the building's electrical system. More commonly, water was heated on the communal stove during one's allocated kitchen time, or boiled using a small electric coil that could be plugged in within one's room. Another technically forbidden but widely practiced adaptation. Breakfast was simple, with kasha, the buckwheat porridge that formed the foundation of the Russian diet, filling and nutritious, if monotonous. Black bread, purchased fresh, if possible. For bread was one of the Soviet Union's great achievements, always available, always affordable, subsidized by the state to ensure that no one would starve for lack of it. Perhaps a small amount of butter or a spoonful of precious sugar to make the meal more palatable. Tea, strong and black, sometimes with a bit of jam stirred in for sweetness rather than sugar, which was often scarce. The journey from room to kitchen to bathroom and back to room required navigation of the shared spaces where one encountered neighbors. These relationships were crucial and complex. In the best circumstances, communalka residents developed systems of mutual aid, taking turns waiting in bread lines so that one person could secure fresh loaves for multiple families, sharing information about where goods might be available, watching each other's children, providing support during illness or crisis. Bonds of genuine friendship could form, particularly among women who spent more time in the communal spaces, who cooked side by side and washed clothes together, and shared the endless work of maintaining life with minimal resources. But the system also bred tensions, and worse, with so many people living in such proximity, with resources so limited, with privacy so thoroughly compromised, conflicts were inevitable. Who was making too much noise? Whose child was misbehaving? Who was using more than their share of hot water or electricity? These small disputes could escalate into bitter feuds that made life miserable for everyone involved. And there was always the darker possibility that a neighbor might report perceived ideological deviance or illegal activity to the authorities, whether from genuine political conviction, from personal malice, or from the belief that such denunciation might improve one's own circumstances. The Soviet state encouraged vigilance among citizens, creating an atmosphere where one could never be entirely certain who might be listening, who might repeat a careless comment made in frustration or despair. The communalka thus became not just a housing arrangement, but a training ground for the dual consciousness that Soviet citizens would develop the ability to maintain public conformity while preserving private thoughts, to participate in official rituals while harboring personal doubts, to speak the expected language while thinking forbidden ideas. After breakfast came the preparation for work or school. Clothing was functional rather than fashionable, for fashion in the Western sense barely existed in the early Soviet period and would remain limited throughout the Union's existence. Everyone wore what was available in state stores, which meant that styles were homogeneous and variety was minimal. Men wore simple suits or workers' coveralls, depending on their occupation. Women wore plain dresses or blouses and skirts, often handmade or adapted from patterns passed among friends. Children wore uniforms to school, brown dresses for girls, dark suits for boys, the red scarf of the pioneers, marking those who had been inducted into the youth organization. The journey to work or school typically involved public transportation, for private automobiles were exceedingly rare, reserved for officials and the privileged few. The tram system in Leningrad, like those in Moscow and other major cities, was extensive and affordable. Tickets costing kopecks, the small change of the ruble. The trams were often crowded, bodies pressed together in an intimacy that would have been uncomfortable if one had not grown accustomed to it. The smell of damp wool in winter, of sweat in summer, of cheap tobacco and makorka, the harsh rolled cigarettes that workers smoked, the resigned faces of people heading to jobs that provided security and basic sustenance, but rarely enthusiasm or fulfillment. Looking out through the fogged windows of a tram in morning light, one saw a city in transformation. Leningrad, the former imperial capital of St. Petersburg, bore the scars of revolution and civil war, but also the promise of socialist construction. Grand palaces and churches stood alongside new buildings in the constructivist style, severe, functional, adorned with slogans rather than ornamentation. Posters proclaimed the achievements of the 5-year plan, showing idealized workers with hammers, raised tractors rolling across vast fields, the red flag flying above industrial complexes. The gap between these images and the reality visible through the tram window, the shabby clothing, the gray exhaustion on people's faces, the unfinished construction projects, the potholes and disrepair. This gap was where Soviet citizens learned to live, acknowledging official achievements while navigating daily challenges. The workday loomed ahead, and for most Soviet citizens, work was not a matter of choice, but of assignment and obligation. The state had abolished unemployment by the simple expedient of guaranteeing everyone a job and making it illegal not to work. Parasitism, living without labor, was a criminal offense. One worked where one was told to work, in the position assigned based on one's education, skills, and the needs of the planned economy. Changing jobs required official permission. Moving to another city required a propiska, an internal passport that controlled where one was allowed to reside. The freedom to choose one's path, to pursue one's ambitions, to relocate in search of opportunity. These were casualties of the system that promised liberation but delivered a different kind of constraint. Yet within these constraints, people built lives. They found moments of beauty and connection. They created small traditions and private meanings. They adapted and survived, and sometimes even found purpose in the grand collective project, believing that their sacrifices would build a better future for their children, that the hardships of the present would eventually give way to the abundance promised by socialist theory. The morning light grew stronger as the sun climbed higher in the winter sky, pale and distant, offering illumination but little warmth. The city awakened fully now, trams crisscrossing the streets, workers streaming into factories, students converging on schools. The great machinery of the Soviet system beginning another day's operation. And within that machinery were millions of individual human beings, each carrying their own hopes and fears, each navigating the space between official expectations and personal reality. Each morning beginning anew the intricate dance of survival and adaptation that defined life in the Soviet Union. Chapter 3: The Factory Floor and the Command Economy. The factory gate stood before me like the entrance to a vast and separate world, and I recall stepping through it as countless millions did each morning, joining the great industrial enterprise. That was the beating heart of the Soviet economic system. The factory was not merely a workplace in the Soviet Union. It was a complete social institution, a provider not just of wages, but of housing, healthcare, vacation vouchers, childcare, and that most precious commodity of all, membership in the working class, the supposed ruling class of the workers' state. The Kirov works in Leningrad, where I found myself on this particular morning in the 1930s, exemplified Soviet industrial ambition, named after Sergei Kirov, a party leader whose assassination in 1934 would provide Stalin with the pretext for accelerating the Great Terror. This factory produced tractors destined for the collective farms that were transforming Soviet agriculture. The facility sprawled across acres, a city within a city, with its own fire brigade, clinic, dining halls, and even housing for key workers. I remember the cacophony that greeted workers upon entering the factory floor, the pounding of metal on metal, rhythmic and relentless, the screech of machinery that had been running continuously since the previous shift ended. For the Soviet factory operated 24 hours a day, production never ceasing in the drive to meet planned targets. The thick smell of oil and hot metal, and the sweat of hundreds of workers, the shouts of foremen making themselves heard above the din, the temperature frigid near the doors where winter air seeped in, sweltering near the furnaces where metal was heated and shaped. The planned economy operated through a system of material balance planning, a method that sounds rational in theory but proved devilishly difficult in practice. Central planners in Moscow, working in Gasplan, the State Planning Committee, would determine how much steel the nation needed, how many tractors should be produced, what quantity of coal must be mined. These targets would then be broken down and assigned to individual factories, mines, and farms across the vast territory of the Soviet Union. Each enterprise received not only production targets, but also allocations of the inputs needed to meet those targets: raw materials, energy, labor, machinery. The worker at his lathe or her assembly station was thus a small part of an enormous calculation, a human element in an equation designed by economists and engineers who believed that production could be rationally planned, that the chaos and waste of capitalist markets could be eliminated through scientific management. But what looked logical on paper confronted the stubborn complexities of reality on the factory floor. I watched as workers operated machinery that should have been replaced years earlier, equipment that broke down frequently and required constant improvisation to keep functioning. The official allocation of spare parts rarely matched actual needs, so factory maintenance teams became masters of adaptation, fabricating replacements from whatever materials were available, cannibalizing one machine to keep 3 others running, maintaining an unofficial inventory of hoarded parts for emergencies. The production targets themselves created perverse incentives, since planned fulfillment was the primary measure of success, and bonuses depended upon meeting or exceeding quotas. Factory managers focused obsessively on hitting the numerical targets, even if this meant sacrificing quality. If the plan called for producing 5,000 tractors, then 5,000 tractors would be produced and reported, whether or not all of them actually functioned properly. The saying went, "They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work," though this was spoken only in trusted company, for such cynicism could be dangerous if reported. The Soviet system created a peculiar relationship between effort and reward. In theory, socialist labor was supposed to be voluntary and enthusiastic, workers contributing their best efforts because they owned the means of production collectively and would benefit from increased productivity. In practice, since wages were largely divorced from actual output, and since even the most efficient worker received roughly the same compensation as a mediocre one, individual productivity often suffered. Why work harder if one received no additional benefit? Why innovate if innovation carried risk of failure and brought little reward? The system of labor guaranteed employment for all, which meant that firing workers was extremely difficult. Enterprise managers, therefore, hoarded labor seeking as many employees as possible, partly because more workers made meeting quotas easier, partly because the number of workers one supervised was a mark of status, and partly because they might be needed during the inevitable crises when equipment failed or materials didn't arrive on schedule. Soviet factories often had twice the number of workers as comparable Western facilities, yet productivity per worker remained stubbornly low. I recall the factory horn sounding for the morning break, 10 precious minutes when workers could step outside for fresh air, smoke a cigarette, exchange a few words with colleagues. The conversation during these breaks revealed much about Soviet industrial life. Grumbling about shortages, the cafeteria had run out of sugar again. A promised shipment of winter boots had not materialized at the factory store. Sharing information, someone's brother-in-law worked at a different factory where they had just received an allocation of fabric, so perhaps one could arrange a trade. Carefully veiled political comments, testing whether one's colleagues shared certain reservations or whether such talk might prove dangerous. The cafeteria served simple fare at subsidized prices: cabbage soup, kasha, kotlety, meat patties of dubious meat content, compote to drink. The food was neither delicious nor satisfying, but it was filling and cheap, ensuring that workers had enough energy to complete their shifts. Many brought additional food from home, supplementing the cafeteria offerings with bread, pickled vegetables, whatever could be secured through the various channels. Official stores, collective farm markets, where peasants sold surplus produce, the black market that everyone knew existed but few acknowledged openly. After the break came more hours of the same rhythmic labor. The worker at the lathe shaping metal components, the precision required despite the tedium, the pride that could still be taken in doing one's job well, even within a system that rarely rewarded excellence. Around him, the vast symphony of Soviet industry played on the clash and roar of 100 processes occurring simultaneously, each supposedly coordinated by the central plan, each actually dependent on countless informal adaptations and improvisations. The factory was also a political space. The party maintained a presence through the factory committee, which organized political education sessions where workers were lectured on Marxist-Leninist theory, on current events as interpreted through official ideology, on the achievements being made in building socialism. Attendance at these sessions was mandatory, though the level of actual attention varied. Workers developed the skill of appearing engaged while their minds wandered to personal concerns, the leak in the apartment that needed repair, the upcoming vacation at a Black Sea sanatorium if their application was approved, the daughter's education and whether she might gain admission to university. The Stakhanovite movement, named after Alexei Stakhanov, a coal miner who supposedly extracted 102 tons of coal in a single shift, 14 times his quota, exemplified the Soviet approach to labor motivation. Workers who exceeded their quotas dramatically were celebrated as heroes, awarded medals, given bonuses, held up as models for others to emulate. But many ordinary workers viewed Stakhanovites with ambivalence or outright hostility, seeing them as rate-busters who made everyone else look bad, whose exceptional output would simply lead to higher quotas for all whose achievements were often the result of special conditions arranged by management rather than individual prowess. The command economy also meant that production bore little relation to actual demand. The planners in Moscow determined what would be produced based on their calculations of what was needed to meet the goals of socialist construction, particularly the emphasis on heavy industry, the Class A industries that produced coal, iron, steel, machinery, consumer goods. The Class B industries were systematically neglected, given lower priority, allocated fewer resources. The result was an economy that could produce remarkable quantities of steel and tractors and weapons, but chronic shortages of shoes, clothing, household goods, anything that might make daily life more comfortable. I remember watching a shipment of newly completed tractors being loaded for transport to collective farms in Ukraine. Massive machines painted in the standard drab color, impressive in their bulk and power. Yet, I also remember hearing whispered among the workers that many of these tractors would break down within months, that the quality was poor, despite meeting the numerical targets, that the collective farms complained constantly about machinery that didn't work properly, that the spare parts needed for repairs were unavailable, that the whole system was riddled with inefficiencies hidden beneath the triumphant statistics. As the workday progressed toward its end, there was the familiar acceleration, the push to complete the day's quota, the informal cooperation among workers who might compete in official ideology but who helped each other in practice. For they understood that they were all caught in the same system, all trying to survive while meeting impossible demands with inadequate resources. The factory horn finally sounded the end of the shift, and workers began the process of cleaning their stations, a point of Soviet industrial discipline that was strictly enforced. Tools returned to their proper places, workspaces swept, machinery shut down properly. Then came the changing rooms, shedding work clothes for street clothes, washing hands and faces as best one could with the available soap and water. The evening shift was already arriving, creating a brief overlap where information was exchanged. What problems had occurred during the day? What machinery needed attention? What materials were running low? This transition between shifts was crucial for maintaining continuity, for ensuring that production didn't falter, for passing along the thousand small details that kept the whole complex operation functioning, despite its inherent inefficiencies. Stepping back out through the factory gate was like emerging from an alternate reality. The evening light was already fading, for winter days in Leningrad were short. The sun, a rare visitor that barely climbed above the horizon before beginning its descent. Workers dispersed toward tram stops, toward the communal apartments and small private apartments that awaited them, toward the few hours of personal time before sleep and the renewal of the cycle. The factory would continue its mechanical song through the night, the machinery never silent, the great project of Soviet industrialization never pausing. But for this shift of workers, the day was done, and they carried with them the fatigue of labor, the small frustrations and occasional satisfactions of work, the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more of the same, that the system they served was both provider and prison, that they were building something grand and terrible, a worker's paradise that somehow never quite arrived despite decades of sacrifice and toil. Chapter 4. The countryside in chains. The morning mist lifted slowly from the Ukrainian steppe, and I recall standing at the edge of a collective farm, a kokos, watching as peasants emerged from their wooden houses to begin another day of labor. In the 1930s, during the period when Stalin's collectivization campaign was remaking Soviet agriculture with a brutality that would scar the countryside for generations, I have witnessed many transformations of rural life across my long years, but few were as violent and catastrophic as Soviet collectivization. To understand daily life in the Soviet Union, one must understand what happened to the land and to those who worked it. For the peasantry constituted the vast majority of the population when the Bolsheviks came to power, and their subjugation was necessary to fund the industrial transformation that Stalin deemed essential for Soviet survival. The logic behind collectivization was both economic and ideological. Economically, the Soviet state needed to extract grain from the countryside to sell abroad, using the hard currency earned to purchase Western technology and machinery for the new factories. Ideologically, the peasantry represented a problem for socialist theory. Marx had envisioned revolution occurring in advanced industrial societies where a large urban proletariat would overthrow the capitalist bourgeoisie. But Russia was primarily agricultural, its peasants still farming small plots, using traditional methods, living in villages that seemed unchanged since medieval times. These peasants were considered ideologically backward, attached to private property, resistant to socialist transformation. Stalin's solution was to forcibly combine the millions of small private farms into large collective farms where land, livestock, and equipment would be owned collectively and production would be planned and controlled by the state. The campaign began in earnest around 1928 and was implemented with a brutality that shocked even some party members. Peasants who resisted, who refused to surrender their land, and animals who were deemed too prosperous and therefore class enemies. These were labeled kulak, a term that had once meant wealthy peasant but now encompassed anyone who opposed collectivization. I remember the bitterness, the rage, and despair of peasants being driven from their ancestral lands. They had survived the Russian Civil War, had endured the earlier period of war communism, when the Bolsheviks had requisitioned grain at gunpoint, had managed to rebuild their lives during the new economic policy when Lenin temporarily allowed private farming to resume. Now they were told that everything they owned belonged to the collective, that their horses and cattle would be pooled, that they would work not their own land but fields designated by agricultural planners in distant offices who had never touched a plow. Many peasants slaughtered their livestock rather than surrender them to the collective. A desperate and destructive protest. If they could not keep their animals, then better to eat them than hand them over. The result was a catastrophic loss of draft animals, horses that pulled plows, oxen that hauled wagons that would cripple Soviet agriculture for years. The livestock population plummeted, and without these animals, farming became even more difficult than it had been. Those identified as kulaks faced deportation to remote regions of Siberia and Kazakhstan, sent to labor camps or special settlements where they would work in mines, construction projects, or timber cutting under appalling conditions. Entire families were uprooted, packed into cattle cars, transported thousands of miles to inhospitable territories where many would perish from cold, hunger, and disease. The number of peasants who died during collectivization and the subsequent famine runs into the millions, though the exact figure remains debated, lost in deliberate obscurity and the chaos of those years. The famine of 1930 to 1933 stands as one of the great crimes of the Soviet system. It was caused partly by collectivization's disruption of traditional farming, partly by the state's insistence on continuing to requisition grain even when harvests failed, partly by the refusal to acknowledge the crisis or request foreign aid. In Ukraine, where the famine hit hardest and became known as the Holodomor, the death toll was especially devastating. I recall villages where houses stood empty, families having disappeared, bodies lying unburied because survivors lacked the strength to dig graves. The Soviet government denied the famine's existence, maintaining that collectivization was proceeding successfully, that harvests were abundant, that socialism was triumphing in the countryside. Foreign journalists who tried to report the truth faced censorship and expulsion. Walter Duranty, the New York Times correspondent in Moscow, notoriously reported that there was no famine, earning himself a Pulitzer Prize for coverage that served Soviet propaganda rather than truth. The world largely remained ignorant or willfully blind to the catastrophe unfolding across the Ukrainian countryside and other grain-producing regions. Those peasants who survived found themselves living in a transformed world. The collective farm, the kolkhoz, became the fundamental unit of Soviet agriculture. In theory, the kolkhoz was owned by its members, who would collectively decide how to organize their work and would share in the harvest after meeting state quotas. In practice, the state controlled everything: what would be planted, how much must be delivered to procurement agencies at prices set far below market value, how the remaining harvest would be distributed. I watched the daily rhythm of kolkhoz life establish itself through the 1930s and into the decades that followed. The workday began early, peasants gathering at the collective farm office where the brigade leader, appointed by the kolkhoz chairman, who was in turn approved by party officials, would assign the day's tasks. These assignments were recorded in workday units, a complicated accounting system meant to track each member's contribution to the collective. At year's end, after the state had taken its requisitioned share and various expenses had been deducted, Whatever remained would theoretically be distributed according to these accumulated workday units. But the distribution was never adequate. Coco's members received payment in kind, grain, vegetables, perhaps a small amount of money, but the quantities were meager, barely sufficient for survival, certainly insufficient for anything resembling comfort or prosperity. The state kept prices for agricultural products artificially low, while charging high prices for industrial goods that peasants might need: tools, cloth, basic manufactured items. This price differential, this exploitation of the countryside to fund urban industrialization, meant that rural life remained desperately poor throughout the Soviet period. The work itself was back-breaking and poorly rewarded: plowing and planting, weeding and harvesting, all done with inadequate equipment because the tractors and machinery produced by Soviet factories were insufficient in number, poor in quality, and constantly breaking down. The promised mechanization of agriculture that was supposed to accompany collectivization never fully materialized. Much agricultural work remained dependent on human and animal labor, performed with tools and methods that would have been familiar to peasants centuries earlier. I recall the composition of the Coco's workforce, increasingly consisting of women, children, and the elderly. Young men were conscripted into the Red Army or left for cities to work in factories, seeking to escape the grinding poverty and lack of opportunity in the countryside. This left behind a workforce that was disproportionately female, aging, and poorly educated. The best and strongest were gone, and those who remained struggled to maintain productivity with inadequate resources and little incentive beyond avoiding punishment for failing to meet state quotas. The private plot became the Coco's members' salvation, a small concession that Stalin grudgingly allowed. Each household was permitted a tiny plot of land, perhaps half an acre, where they could grow vegetables, keep a cow or a few chickens, produce food for their own consumption, or to sell at collective farm markets. These private plots, though representing a tiny fraction of agricultural land, produced a disproportionate share of certain foods: vegetables, fruit, milk, eggs, meat. Peasants devoted their evenings and days off to these plots, lavishing care on their own land that they could not afford to give to the collective fields where they worked without real compensation. The irony was bitter and obvious to all. The private plots, those small remnants of pre-revolutionary farming, were vastly more productive per acre than the collectivized fields. This demonstrated conclusively that socialist agriculture, for all its theoretical superiority, could not match the productivity of peasants working their own land for their own benefit. Yet the system persisted. Ideology trumping evidence, the need to maintain party control over the countryside outweighing considerations of efficiency or human welfare. Life in a rural village in the Soviet Union retained certain traditional elements that had survived revolution and collectivization. The wooden houses, often with decorative carved window frames in traditional patterns. The village well where women gathered to draw water and exchange news. The small wooden church, if it had survived the anti-religious campaigns of the 20s and 30s, perhaps converted into a storehouse or meeting hall, its icons destroyed or hidden, its bells melted down for metal. The village shop, sparsely stocked with basic goods at official prices, though the shelves were often empty, and one had to rely on the private plots and informal exchanges. The social structure of the Cocos replicated the broader Soviet system in miniature. The chairman held real power, controlling work assignments, distribution of resources, relations with party and state officials. Below him were the brigade leaders, each responsible for a group of workers and specific tasks. There were bookkeepers who managed the complex accounting required by central planning. There were mechanics who struggled to keep aging equipment functioning. And there were the ordinary Kokos members at the bottom of the hierarchy, possessing theoretical ownership of the collective property, but in practice having little voice in decisions and little benefit from their labor. Party control extended into the countryside through rural Soviets and party cells established in larger kolkhozes. Political education sessions, though perhaps less frequent than in urban factories, still occurred, with peasants required to attend lectures on Marxist-Leninist theory on international affairs, as interpreted through Soviet ideology on the superiority of collective farming, despite all evidence to the contrary. The gap between official rhetoric and lived reality was even wider in the countryside than in cities, and peasants developed a profound cynicism about party pronouncements that they nevertheless had to pretend to accept. I remember the seasons as experienced in the Soviet countryside, the desperate urgency of spring planting, working long hours to get crops in the ground, hoping for favorable weather because the state would not reduce its requisition quotas regardless of harvest results. The summer labor, weeding and tending, watching the sky for rain or praying for it to stop, for drought and flood were equally devastating. The autumn harvest, racing to bring in the grain before frost or rain destroyed it, working until exhaustion because everything depended on these few crucial weeks. Winter brought a different rhythm. The fields lay frozen and empty. Work continued in the barns, tending to livestock, repairing equipment, cutting firewood, but the pace slowed, and peasants retreated into their homes, huddling around stoves, rationing their food supplies, hoping they would last until spring. Hunger was a constant companion for many, particularly in the years immediately after collectivization. But even in better times, rural diets were monotonous, and barely adequate bread, potatoes, cabbage, perhaps some milk and eggs from the private plot, meat on rare occasions. The villages remained isolated, connected to the broader world only tenuously. Few had electricity in the early decades. Radio broadcasts, when available, brought Soviet propaganda and classical music, but little else. Newspapers arrived irregularly. Most villagers had minimal education, often just a few years of primary schooling. Literacy achieved, but higher learning rare. The best and brightest left if they could, seeing no future in the collective farms, leaving behind those who lacked options or opportunities. Yet even in this harsh environment, human connection persisted. Families maintained bonds, helping each other through difficult times. Neighbors shared what little they had. Traditional celebrations continued, though stripped of religious elements or adapted to Soviet ideology. Weddings, funerals, holidays. These moments brought communities together, provided respite from grinding labor, affirmed that life consisted of more than work and survival. I recall attending a village wedding in the 1950s, where young people married in a civil ceremony in the Koko's office rather than in a church for religious observance, had been driven underground or eliminated entirely in many regions. Yet, the celebration afterward retained traditional elements, singing and dancing. Homemade vodka, despite official restrictions on private distilling. Food prepared from private plots and saved for this special occasion. The community gathering to affirm continuity despite all that had changed. The collective farm system remained a profound dysfunction, throughout Soviet history. Agricultural productivity recovered only slowly from the catastrophe of collectivization. And even in later decades, Soviet agriculture never achieved the efficiency or output of Western farming. The country that had once exported grain became increasingly dependent on imports, purchasing wheat from the United States and Canada to feed its urban population. A humiliating admission of failure for a system that had promised abundance. The countryside bore physical and psychological scars that would not heal. Millions had died. Traditional farming knowledge had been disrupted. The social fabric of rural life had been torn. Those who remained on the kolkhozes understood that they were second-class citizens in the worker state, their labor undervalued, their lives harder and poorer than their urban counterparts, their children's futures limited unless they could escape to the cities. As I stood at the edge of that kolkhoz in the morning light, watching peasants trudge toward the fields, I saw not the triumphant march of socialist agriculture that propaganda proclaimed, but a system built on coercion and sustained by the endurance of people who had little choice but to continue. The land would be worked, the quotas somehow met through superhuman effort and creative accounting. The official statistics would report success. But the human cost remained immense, a price paid by the countryside to fund the industrial cities, a sacrifice extracted, rather than freely given, a wound that would never fully heal, even after the Soviet Union itself had passed into history. Chapter 5: The Landscape of Fear and Silence. The night was deep and silent in Moscow, and I recalled the sound that every Soviet citizen learned to dread, the knock on the door in the darkest hours when decent people were asleep and only the agents of the NKVD were about their grim business. The years I wish to speak of now are the harshest, the period from 1929 to 1953, when Joseph Stalin's rule transformed the Soviet Union into a totalitarian state where terror became a tool of governance, and millions disappeared into the vast archipelago of labor camps that stretched across Siberia and the far north. To understand daily life in the Soviet Union, one must confront this darkness, for the fear it generated shaped every aspect of existence. The revolutionary promise of liberation from oppression had twisted into something nightmarish. A system where no one was safe, where yesterday's heroes became today's enemies, of the people where children were encouraged to denounce parents and friends betrayed each other, where the knock on the door could come for anyone at any time for reasons that made no sense or for no reason at all. I remember the purges beginning even before Stalin had fully consolidated his power. Lenin had established the Cheka, the secret police, during the Civil War, and its successors, the GPU, the OGPU, the NKVD, continued to operate as the sword and shield of the party, as they styled themselves. But under Stalin, these organs of state security expanded beyond combating genuine threats to the revolution. They became instruments for eliminating anyone whom Stalin perceived as a rival, a critic, or simply inconvenient. The Great Purge reached its peak in 1937 and 38, though the terror had been building for years and would continue at varying intensity until Stalin's death. Old Bolsheviks who had made the revolution, who had fought in the Civil War, who had worked with Lenin himself, these men were arrested, forced to confess to absurd crimes in show trials, and then executed or sent to die in camps. The military leadership was decimated, thousands of officers arrested and shot, leaving the Red Army crippled just years before it would face the Nazi invasion. Party officials at every level, were arrested in waves, each new security chief eventually falling victim to the same terror apparatus he had administered. The machinery of terror operated with bureaucratic efficiency. Quotas were set for arrests in each region. So many enemies of the people must be found. So many kulaks, so many members of national minorities suspected of disloyalty. Local NKVD offices competed to over-fulfill these quotas, demonstrating their vigilance by arresting more than required. The arrested were forced to confess under torture, and these confessions implicated others, creating chains of arrests that swept up ever more victims. I recall the atmosphere in Moscow during those years, the fear that permeated everything, the way people watched their words, the sudden disappearances that were not discussed, the apartments that emptied overnight, the families that vanished leaving behind rooms that would be reassigned to others who would move in without asking questions about the previous occupants. Co-workers who had been at their desks one day would be absent the next, and no one would inquire about them, for to ask questions suggested dangerous curiosity. The knock on the door typically came after midnight. A family would be awakened by pounding, by commands to open immediately. NKVD officers would enter, present an arrest warrant that gave no details, no explanation, just a name and the formula, enemy of the people or counter-revolutionary activity. The arrested person would be taken away, sometimes allowed to pack a small bag, sometimes taken immediately in nightclothes. Family members would be left behind, traumatized, frightened, uncertain whether they would ever see their loved one again. The interrogations that followed could last for months. Sleep deprivation, beatings, psychological torture designed to break the prisoner's will and extract the desired confession. It did not matter whether the person was actually guilty of anything. The system required confessions, required enemies to justify its existence, required a steady flow of victims to feed the labor camps that were becoming crucial to the Soviet economy. For innocence was no protection, guilt no requirement. I watched people destroyed for crimes they had not committed, had never imagined committing. A casual remark, overheard and reported. An old letter from a relative abroad. Association with someone who later fell under suspicion. Or simply because someone needed to fill a quota and a name was selected almost at random. The arbitrariness of it was part of the terror's effectiveness. If anyone could be arrested at any time for any reason or no reason, then everyone was vulnerable. Everyone must demonstrate maximum loyalty, maximum vigilance, maximum fear of stepping even slightly out of line. The Gulag labor camp system expanded enormously during these years. Millions of prisoners were transported to remote regions where they would work in gold mines, timber camps, construction projects. In the Arctic, wherever the state needed labor in conditions so harsh that free workers could not be induced to go even with high wages. The prisoners were worked to exhaustion on starvation rations, dying in vast numbers from cold, hunger, disease, and the sheer brutality of the treatment they received. I remember the transit camps where prisoners were gathered before being sent to their final destinations. The cattle cars packed with human beings, traveling for weeks across the vastness of Russia, stopping occasionally to remove the bodies of those who had died during the journey. The arrival at camps in Kolyma, in Vorkuta, in the Kazakh steppe, places whose names became synonymous with suffering, where winter temperatures dropped to -50 degrees and prisoners worked in rags, where rations were calculated to provide just enough calories to sustain life, but not enough for recovery, where the norm was that a prisoner might last 1 or 2 winters before succumbing. Yet, even in these depths, human beings found ways to survive, to maintain some core of dignity and humanity. Prisoners formed informal groups for mutual support. Those with skills, doctors, teachers, engineers, tried to help others. Cultural life continued in improvised forms, prisoners reciting poetry from memory, teaching each other languages, organizing clandestine religious services for those who maintained faith despite everything. The camps were designed to break people, to reduce them to animals fighting over scraps, but many refused to be entirely broken, clinging to their humanity even as their bodies wasted away. What made the Stalinist terror particularly horrifying was that, unlike Nazi Germany, where one could hope to avoid persecution by not being Jewish or Roma or otherwise targeted, in the Soviet Union, no category of person was safe. The torturers themselves were arrested and tortured. NKVD chiefs like Yagoda and Yezhov, who had overseen vast waves of terror, were themselves eventually arrested and executed. Party loyalists of decades standing, who had never wavered in their commitment to socialism, found themselves accused of being fascist agents or Trotskyite conspirators. The system consumed its own children with horrifying regularity. The families of those arrested suffered a special stigma. Under the doctrine of collective responsibility, relatives could be punished for the crimes of their family members. Wives of arrested men were often arrested themselves. Children were sent to orphanages, given new names, raised to forget their disgraced parents, or they remained free but marked, unable to attend university, barred from certain professions, condemned to lives of diminished opportunity because of their tainted family background. Yet life somehow continued for those not yet arrested. People went to work, stood in lines for bread, attended political meetings where they applauded the latest party pronouncements. They developed the ability to maintain 2 separate realities in their minds: the public reality, where everything was wonderful, socialism was triumphing, and anyone arrested must have deserved it, and the private reality, where they knew that the system was insane, that innocent people were being destroyed, that they themselves might be next. But there was nothing they could do about it. The denunciation became a tool of personal revenge, of professional advancement, of extracting oneself from suspicion by redirecting it toward others. Want a colleague's apartment or position? Write a denunciation claiming they spoke critically of Stalin. Want to end a marriage without the trouble of divorce? Report your spouse for anti-Soviet activity. The NKVD would investigate, and even if they determined the accusation was false, the accused person would remain under suspicion, life ruined by malice that could never be fully cleared. I recall the practice of extracting confessions, not just from the accused, but from their friends and associates, building cases that implicated dozens or hundreds of people in supposed conspiracies that existed only in the fevered imaginations of interrogators, or the desperate inventions of prisoners who would say anything to stop the torture. These confessions, obtained through methods that violated every norm of justice, were then used in show trials where defendants dutifully recited their supposed crimes before being sentenced to death or imprisonment. The show trials of the mid-30s were particularly grotesque spectacles. Old Bolsheviks like Bukharin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, men who had made the revolution alongside Lenin, appeared in court to confess to being spies, saboteurs, and assassins in the pay of foreign powers. The confessions were absurd, the evidence laughable, but the verdicts were predetermined. Western observers who attended these trials were divided. Some recognized them as obscene farces. Others accepted them as evidence that the Soviet Union was besieged by traitors, and therefore justified in its vigilance. The paranoia extended to all spheres of life. Geneticists who followed Mendelian genetics rather than the politically approved theories of Lysenko were arrested. Linguists, economists, historians who held views that contradicted party orthodoxy found themselves accused of bourgeois contamination. Writers who failed to produce work in the socialist realist style that glorified the party and its achievements faced censorship, imprisonment, or worse. The intellectual life of the nation was strangled, creativity suppressed, genuine debate replaced by the mechanical repetition of approved formulas. Foreign communists who had come to the Soviet Union seeking to help build socialism or to escape persecution in their home countries often found themselves arrested as spies. The Spanish Civil War refugees, German communists fleeing the Nazis, Polish party members, thousands were arrested and disappeared into the Gulag. Their loyalty to the communist cause, no protection against Soviet paranoia. The invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany in June of 1941 brought temporary relief from some forms of terror as the regime focused on survival. Political prisoners were sometimes released from camps and sent to the front, given a chance to redeem themselves through combat. The unity of purpose during the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called it, created a brief period when political suspicions were somewhat relaxed and the emphasis was on defeating the external enemy. But after the war, the terror resumed. Returning prisoners of war who had endured German captivity were suspected of ideological contamination and sent to Soviet camps. Entire ethnic groups, Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, were deported from their homelands on Stalin's orders, accused of collective treason, loaded into cattle cars and dumped in Central Asia or Siberia, where many died. The late 40s brought new waves of arrests: the Leningrad affair, the doctor's plot, fresh paranoia, and fresh victims. Stalin's death in March of 1953 brought the most intense phase of terror to an end, though the relief was gradual and uncertain. The population had lived under this shadow for so long that the fear remained even after the worst had passed. Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, where he detailed Stalin's crimes, brought some rehabilitation of victims, some acknowledgement of the terror's unjustness. But many perpetrators were never held accountable. Many victims never officially exonerated. Many families never learned the fates of their disappeared relatives. The psychological impact of living through this period shaped generations. Even in the relatively more relaxed atmosphere of the Khrushchev and Brezhnev eras, Soviet citizens retained a deep wariness, an instinct for self-censorship, an understanding that there were things one did not say, topics one did not discuss, that safety lay in conformity and silence. The trauma of the Stalin years created a society where trust was difficult, where friendships were guarded, where the private and public selves existed in separate spheres that must never be confused. I stood in Red Square on the morning after Stalin died, watching people weep, genuinely grieving for the man who had terrorized them, had murdered millions, had created a system of fear that poisoned every relationship. The complexity of their emotions, the sincere belief in socialism mixed with personal suffering, the pride in Soviet achievements alongside the knowledge of terrible crimes, the relief that the tyrant was dead mixed with uncertainty about what would come next. This revealed the profound psychological damage that totalitarianism inflicts, the way it distorts even the victim's understanding of their own experience. The landscape of fear and silence that I have described was not the entirety of Soviet life, but it was the foundation upon which everything else was built. The communal apartments, the factory work, the collective farms, the schools and hospitals all existed within this larger context of political terror that could intrude at any moment, that demanded constant vigilance, that required participation in the rituals of loyalty while never fully believing, never fully trusting, always maintaining a cautious distance between what one showed publicly and what one felt privately. This was the terrible price of the Soviet experiment, the cost of attempting to remake human society through coercion rather than consent, the consequence of a system that valued ideological purity over human life, that placed the party and its power above all other considerations, that created a machinery of repression so vast and terrible that it survived its creator and left scars that have not healed even now, decades after the Soviet Union itself has passed into history. Chapter 6. The Architecture of Everyday Survival. The morning sun illuminated Moscow in 1962, and I recalled the subtle but significant changes that had transformed daily Soviet life in the years following Stalin's death. The pervasive terror had diminished, though wariness remained. Khrushchev's reforms, his denunciation of Stalin's crimes, his attempts to make socialism more humane, these had created a thaw in Soviet society, a period when people began to breathe a little more freely, when the omnipresent fear receded, if not entirely disappeared. I wish to speak now of the practical mechanics of daily existence, the strategies and adaptations that Soviet citizens developed to navigate a system that promised abundance but delivered chronic shortage, that guaranteed security but required constant vigilance, that provided certain benefits while demanding participation in endless official rituals. The morning routine in a private apartment, and by the 1960s, more families had achieved this modest goal, began with an assessment of what needed to be accomplished that day beyond work obligations. Shopping was not a simple matter of going to a store and purchasing what one needed, as it might be in Western countries. Soviet shopping required strategy, persistence, information networks, and often considerable luck. The state shops, the gastronomes for food, and the universums for other goods, operated on principles fundamentally different from market economies. Prices were set centrally and kept artificially low, which meant that demand vastly exceeded supply for most consumer goods. The result was chronic shortage and the ubiquitous queue, the line of people waiting to purchase whatever had become available. I remember the complex art of Soviet shopping. One needed to know which stores might receive shipments of desired goods, and timing was crucial. Word would spread through informal networks at a workplace, among neighbors, through friends, that a particular store had received a delivery of winter coats or shoes or oranges. Upon hearing such news, one dropped everything to join the queue immediately, for the goods would not last long. The queue itself was a social institution with its own rules and etiquette. People would arrive early, establishing a numbered list so that one could leave for a time and return without losing one's place. Neighbors might take turns standing in line, one person holding places for several families. In the bread line, the person who had secured fresh loaves would bring back enough for several households, reciprocating the favor done for them previously or establishing an obligation to be repaid later. Some queues were remarkably long and required extraordinary patience. I recall lines that stretched for blocks, hundreds of people waiting for hours to reach the counter, enduring cold or heat, fatigue, and boredom, all for the chance to purchase items that elsewhere in the world were ordinary and abundant. The time spent in queues represented a hidden tax on the population, unpaid labor extracted by a distribution system that functioned poorly but was never seriously reformed. The shopping experience itself was peculiar. Unlike Western stores, where goods were displayed and customers could select items themselves, Soviet stores kept most merchandise behind counters. One would queue first to determine whether the desired item was available and at what price, then queue again at the cashier to pay and receive a receipt, then queue a third time to present the receipt and actually receive the goods. This cumbersome system created opportunities for petty theft and corruption while making even simple purchases time-consuming ordeals. The quality of goods was often poor and selection minimal. Soviet industry focused on meeting quantitative targets rather than producing items that consumers actually wanted or that functioned reliably. Shoes that wore out quickly, clothing in unattractive styles and limited sizes, household appliances that broke down frequently. These were the norm. If one found something of acceptable quality, the wise course was to purchase it immediately, regardless of current need, for it might not be available again for months or years. The concept of blat became essential to successful navigation of the Soviet system. Blat referred to informal networks of mutual assistance, to connections that could provide access to goods and services unavailable through official channels. Having a relative who worked in a store meant early information about shipments and perhaps the ability to purchase items before they reached the general public. Knowing someone in a factory meant access to products that facility produced. Friendship with a doctor ensured better medical care. Connection with a bureaucrat helped navigate the maze of permits and permissions required for various activities. These networks were not quite corruption, though they shaded into it. They were survival mechanisms in a system where official channels functioned inadequately. One accumulated social capital through favors done for others, creating obligations that could be called upon when needed. The person who could provide access to scarce goods or navigate bureaucratic obstacles possessed valuable currency, more useful in many circumstances than actual rubles. The parallel economy, the shadow market that operated alongside official channels, grew increasingly important during the Brezhnev era. Some of this was straightforwardly illegal: black market goods, stolen merchandise, sold for personal profit. But much existed in a gray zone that the authorities tolerated because the alternative would have been worse. Private individuals who possessed skills, plumbers, electricians, car mechanics, offered services unofficially, being paid under the table, supplementing their official wages with income from private work that filled gaps left by inadequate state services. The collective farm markets, where Coco's members could sell produce from their private plots, represented a legal form of private enterprise within the socialist system. These markets offered better quality and greater variety than state stores, though at higher prices. Vegetables that were fresh rather than rotting eggs that were actually available. Milk from identifiable cows rather than mysterious sources. These could be obtained at the Rynak, the market, if one had the money and was willing to pay prices several times higher than official stores. Daily life involved constant calculation and adaptation. One needed to know when stores might receive deliveries, where one's BLAT network could provide access, what might be obtained through official channels versus black market purchases. Every shopping trip required decisions about how to allocate limited resources. Money was not the only constraint, but also time, energy, and the social capital represented by favors owed and obligations that could be called upon. The workplace served functions far beyond mere employment. It was through one's workplace that many necessities were allocated housing. Vacation vouchers, consumer goods that became available in limited quantities and were distributed to employees. Workplaces provided childcare, running kindergartens and nurseries so that both parents could work. They organized cultural activities, arranged group outings to theaters or museums, celebrated official holidays with collective gatherings. The trade union, though not an independent worker organization, as in Western countries, administered various benefits and served as an intermediary between workers and management. It distributed the vouchers for vacation at state-run sanatoria, those combination resorts and health spas where Soviet workers could spend a week or two annually at heavily subsidized prices. The better sanatoria, those on the Black Sea coast or in desirable locations, were allocated based on a combination of merit, need, political reliability, and connections. Workers competed for access, understanding that this was one of the significant perks that made Soviet employment bearable. The housing situation improved considerably during the Khrushchev era, with the mass construction of the apartment blocks known as Khrushchevkas. These 5-story buildings, built quickly and cheaply using standardized prefabricated panels, were architecturally undistinguished and offered minimal space, tiny kitchens, thin walls, cramped rooms, but they provided something precious: private apartments for families who had been living in communal conditions for decades. I remember families receiving keys to new Khrushchevka apartments, their joy at having their own entrance, their own bathroom and kitchen, privacy that had been absent from their lives for years. The apartments were modest by any objective standard, but the relief of escaping the communalka made them feel luxurious. No more strategic planning to use the bathroom, no more conflicts over kitchen time, no more concern that a neighbor might report one's private conversations. The psychological benefit was immense. Yet, even with improved housing, waiting lists remained long. Young couples might wait years for an apartment allocation. Priority went to those with larger families, with longer service at important enterprises, with connections to officials who controlled housing distribution. The system created its own inequalities, different from capitalist wealth stratification, but real nonetheless. The nomenklatura and other privileged groups received better apartments in better locations, while ordinary workers made do with less desirable accommodations. Healthcare was provided by the state, free of charge, a genuine achievement that the system took pride in. Clinics and hospitals existed throughout the country, and everyone had access to medical care without concern about cost. Yet the quality varied dramatically. Equipment was often outdated, medications in short supply. The best doctors gravitating toward positions that served the elite rather than ordinary clinics. Here too, connections mattered. Knowing a doctor personally, being able to offer gifts or favors, could mean the difference between perfunctory care and genuine attention. Education followed similar patterns. Universal literacy had been achieved. Schools existed everywhere. University education was free for those who gained admission. The Soviet education system produced many well-trained scientists, engineers, and professionals, but access to the best institutions depended partly on examination scores and partly on other factors: family background, party connections, the willingness of parents to provide unofficial payments to tutors or to grease various palms. The system was meritocratic in theory, but compromised by the reality that privilege found ways to reproduce itself even in a supposedly classless society. The daily newspaper, Pravda, or its local equivalent, arrived at workplaces and was nominally read by conscientious citizens. In practice, many glanced at headlines, read the sports results or cultural listings, and ignored the political content that everyone knew was propaganda. The gap between official media and reality was so wide that most people learned to decode the language, to read between the lines, to understand what was not being said. Television became more widespread during the 1960s and 70s. The sets expensive but increasingly common. Programming was limited and heavily censored, but certain shows became cultural phenomena: serial dramas, classic films, sports broadcasts, the carefully curated news program, Vremya. Families gathered around their televisions for shared viewing experiences that created common cultural references across the vast Soviet territory. The evening meal, prepared in that tiny Khrushchevka kitchen, reflected the constraints and adaptations of Soviet life. The ingredients were what had been available during shopping expeditions: cabbage, potatoes, onions, perhaps some meat if one had been fortunate, black bread always. Recipes were adapted to work with available ingredients rather than ideal ones. Cookbooks circulated in handwritten copies, shared among friends, preserving knowledge of how to prepare more varied dishes when the right ingredients could be obtained. After dinner came a few hours of personal time before sleep, time that might be spent reading, visiting neighbors, listening to music on a radio or record player, perhaps watching television. This time was precious, a respite from work obligations and the public performance of Soviet citizenship. In trusted company, family, close friends, conversations could become more honest. Private opinions could be carefully shared. The facade of enthusiasm for the system could be dropped temporarily. The kitchen table became the site of these authentic conversations. What became known as kitchen table discussions, late into the night, over tea or vodka. People would talk about topics that could not be discussed publicly: the failures of the system, the privileges of the nomenclatura, the latest semistat literature that circulated in typed copies, the frustrations of daily life, the dreams of perhaps traveling abroad, though few would ever receive permission. These conversations were conducted cautiously, even among trusted friends, for one could never be entirely certain, and the habit of wariness died hard. The weekend offered some variation from the weekday routine. Saturday was still a work day for many, but Sunday provided genuine rest. Some families would take excursions to parks or to the countryside if they had access to a car, which was rare. More commonly, Sunday meant sleeping late, attending to household chores that had accumulated during the week, visiting relatives, perhaps going to a museum or attending a concert if tickets could be obtained. The state did provide certain cultural opportunities at prices ordinary citizens could afford. Theater tickets, classical music concerts, ballet performances, these were subsidized and accessible. The Soviet Union produced world-class performers, and maintained high standards in classical arts, even as it suppressed more experimental or Western-influenced work. A worker could attend the Bolshoi Ballet for the price of a few loaves of bread, an egalitarian access to high culture that stood in contrast to the many failures and restrictions of the system. Leisure activities were often organized through official channels, workplace social clubs, neighborhood organizations, party-sponsored events. These provided structure and opportunity, but also maintained the system's presence in all aspects of life. The sense that one was never entirely free, never completely outside the state's organizing and monitoring apparatus. Yet, within these structures, people carved out spaces for authentic experience, for genuine relationships, for personal meaning that transcended official narratives, the human capacity to adapt, to find joy in small things, to maintain hope despite disappointment. This capacity sustained millions through the decades of Soviet life. As I watched families settle into their evening routines in their small apartments, as I observed the complex strategies they employed to navigate shortages and bureaucracy, as I sensed the mixture of resignation and resilience that characterized their attitudes, I understood that daily life in the Soviet Union was neither the nightmare of Western propaganda nor the paradise of Soviet claims. It was something more complex, a system that provided certain security and benefits while demanding conformity and extracting constant compromises. A life that most people managed to find bearable, if not joyous, sustainable, if not inspiring. A life that millions lived for decades until finally the entire structure collapsed and forced them to adapt once more to yet another dramatic transformation. Chapter 7. The education of the new Soviet person. The morning bell rang across Moscow school in 1968, and I recall the sound of hundreds of children's feet echoing through corridors as they made their way to classrooms, each wearing the identical uniform that marked them as students in the Soviet educational system. To understand life in the Soviet Union, one must understand how the state shaped its youngest citizens, for education was never merely about literacy and mathematics. It was about creating the new Soviet man, molding children into citizens who would embody socialist values, serve the collective, and perpetuate the system that had given them life. I watched a girl of 13, Natasha, arrive at school that autumn morning, her brown dress covered by the black apron that marked ordinary school days, the white apron reserved for special occasions. Around her neck, the red scarf of the pioneers, that ubiquitous symbol of belonging to the collective youth organization that enrolled nearly every Soviet child between the ages of 9 and 14. The scarf was not merely decorative. It represented membership in an organization that would track each child's ideological development, their participation in collective activities, their suitability for eventual advancement within the system. The Soviet school was designed as a total environment, encompassing not just academic instruction, but political education, character formation, and preparation for one's role in the socialist economy. The school day began early, typically at 8:30 in the morning, and continued until mid-afternoon, 6 days a week. The curriculum was standardized across the entire Soviet Union, from Moscow to Vladivostok, from Leningrad to Tashkent. A child in Ukraine studied exactly the same mathematics, learned the same historical interpretations, read the same literary texts as a child in Kazakhstan or Estonia. This uniformity ensured ideological consistency and facilitated the mobility that the planned economy required. For a family transferred from one city to another, could be confident that their children's education would continue without disruption. The morning began with a pioneer ceremony, a ritual that I observed countless times, yet never ceased to find revealing. The children stood in formation in the assembly hall, their red scarves bright against the brown uniforms. At the front, the pioneer leader, often a young adult, studying education or performing communal service, called them to attention. The Soviet flag was raised while children stood at attention, hands raised in the pioneer salute. Then came the recitation of the pioneer oath, young voices speaking in unison. I, a young pioneer of the Soviet Union, in the presence of my comrades, solemnly promise to passionately love my Soviet motherland, to live, study, and struggle as the great Lenin bequeathed, according to the laws of the pioneers of the Soviet Union. The words were familiar, repeated so often they had become automatic, yet there remained something powerful about this collective affirmation. The children were being socialized into a system that emphasized group identity over individuality, duty to the state over personal desire, the glory of the Soviet project over private ambitions. The ceremony created bonds between students who would grow up together, study together, eventually work together in various branches of the Soviet economy, united by shared experiences and common language. After the ceremony came the academic lessons, and here the Soviet system achieved genuine rigor alongside ideological indoctrination. Mathematics was taught with seriousness and depth. Soviet students typically completed coursework in algebra, geometry, trigonometry, and calculus by the time they finished secondary school, covering material that in many Western countries would be considered university level. The emphasis on mathematics and sciences reflected the system's need for engineers and technical specialists who could maintain industrial production and military capability. I recall sitting in on a mathematics lesson where the teacher, a stern woman who had dedicated her career to education, explained concepts at the blackboard while students took meticulous notes. The teaching style was traditional and authoritarian. The teacher was the unquestioned authority. Students were expected to absorb information and demonstrate mastery through recitation and problem solving at the board. Original thinking was less valued than correct execution of established methods. The emphasis was on rote learning, memorization, and the ability to reproduce what had been taught. Physics and chemistry were similarly rigorous, with students conducting experiments in school laboratories, learning scientific principles that would prepare some of them for careers in research or engineering. Biology was taught with careful navigation around topics that might conflict with Marxist-Leninist materialism. But the basic science was sound. The Soviet Union produced many excellent scientists and mathematicians, and the foundation was laid in these secondary schools, where education was taken seriously, even if critical thinking was discouraged. Russian literature formed another pillar of the curriculum, though here ideology shaped interpretation more directly. Students studied the great Russian classics, Pushkin, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, but these authors were presented through the lens of Soviet criticism. Tolstoy became a critic of feudal oppression rather than a Christian mystic. Dostoevsky's religious concerns were downplayed in favor of his social commentary. The message was that Russian literary tradition had been preparing the ground for Soviet socialism, that these writers had critiqued the old order and thus contributed, perhaps unconsciously, to its eventual overthrow. Soviet literature was studied with particular attention, works that glorified the revolution, celebrated collective achievement, and portrayed life in the Soviet Union as progressively improving. Maxim Gorky, Mikhail Shalakhov, Alexander Faddeev, these writers who had produced work in the socialist realist style received extensive study. More experimental or critical writers were simply absent from the curriculum, their existence unknown to most students. History lessons were perhaps the most ideologically controlled. Soviet history was taught as a narrative of inevitable progress from feudalism through capitalism to socialism. With the October Revolution as the pivotal moment when Russia leaped ahead of the backward capitalist world, Lenin was portrayed as a genius without flaw. Stalin's crimes were mentioned only obliquely, if at all, during the Khrushchev thaw, and not at all before or significantly after. The history of the Communist Party became synonymous with Russian history, with pre-revolutionary Russia depicted as backward and oppressive, and the Soviet period as liberation and advancement. World history followed Marxist-Leninist interpretations, emphasizing class struggle, the exploitation of workers under capitalism, the progressive nature of socialist movements. American and European history were presented through a critical lens that highlighted injustice and inequality while minimizing achievements or freedoms. Students learned that capitalism was a dying system, that the socialist camp represented the future, that the Cold War was caused by Western aggression against peaceful Soviet intentions. I watched students absorb these lessons with varying degrees of belief. Younger children generally accepted what they were taught without question, their minds not yet capable of critical analysis. Older students, particularly those whose families maintained private skepticism about official narratives, learned to navigate between public performance and private understanding. They could recite the correct answers on examinations while harboring doubts that were never expressed except to the most trusted friends. After morning lessons came lunch in the school cafeteria, where simple but nutritious meals were provided at subsidized prices that made them affordable for all families. The food was the standard Soviet fare: cabbage soup, kasha, cutlety, compote. The equality of the cafeteria, everyone eating the same meal in the same setting, reinforced the collective nature of Soviet education. There were no packed lunches from home that might reveal differences in family circumstances, no ability to purchase better food that might create hierarchies of wealth. Afternoon classes continued the academic program, but the school day did not end with academic instruction. Extracurricular activities were organized through the school and the pioneers, providing structured activities that served multiple purposes. They kept children occupied while parents worked. They developed talents that might serve the state, and they furthered the socialization of children into Soviet values and collective behavior. Natasha participated in choir practice that afternoon, joining other students in learning patriotic songs that would be performed at the upcoming LIF celebration of the October Revolution. Other days might bring different activities: sports teams, training for competitions between schools, chess clubs, where the game that Russians excelled at was studied seriously, technical circles where children learned basic engineering or electronics, volunteering activities where students would collect scrap metal or help with agricultural work during harvest season. These activities were not merely recreational, they were part of the comprehensive program to develop well-rounded Soviet citizens who were physically fit, culturally educated, technically skilled, and ideologically reliable. The system left little room for unstructured play or spontaneous exploration. Childhood itself was organized, directed, monitored, shaped, toward producing adults who would fit seamlessly into their assigned roles within the planned economy. The Komsomol, the Communist Youth League, for those aged 14 to 28, represented the next stage in this developmental pipeline. When students completed their pioneer years, they typically joined the Komsomol, which would play an even more important role in their lives. Komsomol membership became part of one's permanent record and significantly affected future opportunities. University admissions, job placements, career advancement, all were influenced by one's Komsomol participation and the recommendations one received from Komsomol officials. I attended a Komsomol meeting where university options were being discussed for students approaching graduation. The atmosphere was more serious than pioneer gatherings. These were young adults now, on the verge of making decisions that would shape their lives. The Komsomol leader, a university student fulfilling his own organizational obligations, presented information about various institutions and fields of study. Engineering is particularly needed in the current 5-year plan, he explained, especially in electronics and automation. The Moscow Engineering Physics Institute is seeking qualified applicants, and Komsomol members with strong academic records will receive priority consideration. The message was clear and would have been understood by all present. Individual talents and interests should be subordinated to state priorities. The system offered genuine opportunities for upward mobility. A worker's daughter could become an engineer. A peasant's son could become a scientist, but these opportunities came with strings attached. One advanced by demonstrating not just competence, but also ideological reliability, by channeling one's ambitions through approved channels, by accepting the system's right to direct one's path. I watched Natasha, now 18, and preparing for university entrance examinations, navigate these expectations. She excelled in mathematics and sciences, marking her as a good candidate for engineering education. Her Komsomol participation had been satisfactory, if not outstanding. She attended meetings, volunteered for community service projects, demonstrated appropriate enthusiasm without being excessively zealous. Her family background was acceptable, working-class parents without political complications in their past. Yet alongside this public participation, she maintained a private life that diverged from official expectations. She listened to Beatles records copied onto bootleg recordings. She read samizdat literature that circulated among trusted friends. She harbored curiosities about the West and questions about Soviet society that she knew better than to express publicly. This dual consciousness, this ability to perform the required rituals while maintaining private reservations, was a survival skill that most Soviet young people developed by adolescence. The educational system had created what it intended, a technically competent, basically literate population that could staff the factories and institutions of the planned economy. But it had also created something unintended, generations of people who learned to distinguish between official rhetoric and observable reality, who developed sophisticated skills in reading between lines and maintaining separate public and private selves, who participated in the system's rituals while harboring doubts they dared not fully articulate. I remember graduation ceremonies where students received their diplomas, delivered speeches about serving the motherland, pledged to work wherever the state directed them. The ceremony was moving in its way, marking a genuine transition from childhood to adulthood, celebrating real achievements in education that represented years of effort. Yet, even in this moment of triumph, the constraints were visible. These young people were not free to pursue their dreams wherever they might lead. They would go where they were told, work in positions assigned to them, live where permission was granted. Some would attend university, competing for limited spaces in a system where admission depended on examination scores, but also on factors less transparent: family connections, political reliability, sometimes payments made to influential figures. Those who did not gain university admission would enter technical schools for more specialized training, or they would enter the workforce directly, taking positions in factories or offices or on collective farms. For young women, additional pressures existed. Soviet ideology proclaimed gender equality, and women did work in all sectors of the economy. But traditional expectations about marriage and motherhood remained strong. A young woman was expected to pursue education and career, but also to marry and have children, to manage household labor that was never equally shared with men despite official rhetoric about equality. The double burden of full-time work and primary responsibility for home and children would shape women's lives throughout the Soviet period. The youth culture that emerged in the 1960s and 70s, particularly in larger cities, represented a subtle form of resistance to total state control. Young people were drawn to Western music, fashion, and attitudes despite official disapproval. Blue jeans became symbols of alternative identity, coveted items that were difficult to obtain legally but that circulated through black markets and were treasured by those who managed to acquire them. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Western rock music, these were consumed avidly despite being officially discouraged as examples of decadent Western culture. I recall young people gathering in private apartments to listen to music, to dance, to experience something that felt authentic and uncontrolled by the state. These gatherings were not overtly political. Few participants imagined themselves as dissidents or revolutionaries. They simply wanted space for self-expression, for exploration of identities not entirely determined by official categories, for experiences that felt genuine rather than performed. The educational system had succeeded in producing a literate, technically trained population capable of maintaining the Soviet industrial economy and military apparatus. It had instilled certain values: collectivism, duty to the state, respect for authority. It had created shared cultural references and common experiences that bound Soviet citizens together despite vast geographic and ethnic diversity. But it had also produced generations who had learned skepticism, who could see the gaps between promises and reality, who maintained private truths alongside public performances. These young people would eventually inherit the Soviet Union, and their dual consciousness, their ability to participate in the system while harboring doubts about it, would contribute to the system's ultimate fragility when the contradictions became too great to sustain. As I watched Natasha and her classmates step out of the school building on that graduation day, moving toward adult lives that would be shaped by forces beyond their control, yet which they would navigate with varying degrees of success and satisfaction, I understood that the Soviet educational system was both impressive achievement and profound limitation. It had created human capital for the planned economy while constraining human potential in ways that would eventually prove unsustainable. The evening light fell across the schoolyard as parents gathered to photograph their children in their graduation finery, proud of achievements earned through years of hard work within a system that was simultaneously nurturing and constraining. The future stretched before these young people, predictable in its broad outlines, yet uncertain in its particulars. Shaped by the Soviet system's structures, yet not entirely determined by them. They would make lives within these constraints, find meaning within these limitations, survive, and sometimes even flourish in a society that promised much, delivered some things, and denied others that in different circumstances they might never have known to desire. Chapter 8. The Rhythm of Labor and Leisure. The factory horn sounded across Moscow in 1975, and I recalled the shift change at a research facility where engineers and technicians worked on components for Soviet television sets, those increasingly common appliances that were bringing state-controlled programming into millions of homes. The rhythm of work and leisure in the Brezhnev era had settled into patterns that would persist until the system's final years, patterns characterized by minimal innovation, stable, if modest, living standards, and an increasingly elaborate informal economy that compensated for the formal economy's failures. Natasha, now 25, and an engineer at this facility, had achieved a position that represented genuine upward mobility from her working-class origins. Soviet society, despite its many failures, did provide pathways for talented individuals to rise regardless of family wealth. For education was free, and admission to universities was ostensibly based on merit. She had her own small apartment in a newer building, slightly better than the Khrushchevka's, though still modest by Western standards. She had a profession that commanded some respect and provided a decent salary. She had achieved the basic stability that represented success in Soviet terms. The work itself, however, was often frustrating. The research facility was supposed to be developing improved television components, advancing Soviet technology to compete with Western manufacturers. But the reality fell far short of these aspirations. Equipment was outdated, having last been updated years ago despite promises of modernization. The emphasis remained on meeting production quotas rather than genuine innovation. For innovation carried risk of failure, and the system penalized failure more severely than it rewarded success. I watched Natasha in her small office, really just a glass-walled cubicle at the edge of the facility floor, reviewing production reports and dealing with the inevitable problems that arose when materials ran short or machinery broke down. As a section supervisor, she occupied an uncomfortable middle position, caught between the demands of management who insisted that quotas must be met and the realities faced by workers who struggled with inadequate resources. The morning meeting with other supervisors revealed the persistent challenges. The factory director announced that production targets for the quarter had been increased by 12%, a substantial rise that had been decreed by ministry officials in Moscow who were responding to pressure from party leadership to demonstrate economic growth. Where the additional materials would come from remained unclear, and everyone in the room understood that they would be expected to find reserves, a euphemism for cutting corners, working faster, perhaps manipulating statistics to report fulfillment, even if actual output fell short. This gap between official statistics and reality had become endemic throughout the Soviet economy. The system generated impressive numbers, industrial production growing, quotas exceeded, the 5-year plan successfully completed. But those who worked within the system knew that the numbers were often fiction, that quality was sacrificed for quantity, that innovation was stifled, that the economy was far less dynamic and productive than official figures suggested. Yet the workplace provided more than just employment. It remained a social institution that organized many aspects of life beyond work itself. Through her workplace, Natasha had received her apartment allocation, had obtained vouchers for vacation at a Black Sea sanatorium, had accessed goods that were available through the facility's distribution system rather than ordinary stores. The trade union, though it did not function as an independent worker organization, administered benefits and provided various services. I remember the workplace culture that had developed during the Brezhnev years, sometimes called the era of stagnation by those who lived through it, though the term would not become common until later. There was a tacit agreement between the state and the workers. The state guaranteed employment, housing, basic security, and workers in return provided minimal effort sufficient to maintain the appearance of productivity while not pushing for change. Job security was nearly absolute. Firing workers was extremely difficult, even for poor performance. So workers had little incentive to work harder than necessary to avoid overt trouble. The phrase "we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us" captured this dynamic, though it was spoken only in trusted company. Wages were modest but stable, adequate for basic needs, if not for comfort or luxury. But money alone did not determine living standards in the Soviet system. Access to goods and services depended on connections, on one's position, on membership in the nomenklatura, or relationships with those who controlled distribution. The midday meal in the facility cafeteria was a social occasion as much as sustenance. The food was basic, the inevitable cabbage soup, kasha, kotlety, compote, but it was cheap and filling. Natasha sat with other engineers and supervisors, and the conversation revealed much about Soviet workplace culture. Complaints about shortages, sharing information about where goods might be available, discussion of vacation plans, carefully veiled political observations that tested whether colleagues shared certain perspectives. My brother managed to get tickets for a Vysotsky concert next month, someone mentioned, lowering her voice slightly. Vladimir Vysotsky occupied a unique space in Soviet culture, immensely popular for his rough-voiced performances of songs that pushed boundaries without quite crossing into outright dissident, tolerated by authorities as a safety valve that allowed some expression of frustration and criticism in controlled doses. The afternoon brought more meetings, more paperwork, more attempts to solve problems created by the command economy's rigidities. A machine had broken down on the production floor, and getting the necessary spare parts required navigating. A system where official channels moved slowly and often failed entirely. The solution, as always, involved personal connections, calling a counterpart at another facility where Natasha had previously done a favor, trading components, maintaining the informal networks that actually kept Soviet industry functioning, despite the formal system's inadequacies. The workday ended at 5, and Natasha joined the stream of workers heading to the metro for the journey home. The Moscow metro remained impressive, its stations decorated with mosaics and chandeliers, kept immaculately clean, the trains running with remarkable reliability. This was Soviet engineering at its best, maintaining infrastructure that worked and that ordinary citizens could take pride in using. The evening offered a few hours of personal time, precious freedom from work obligations and official activities. Natasha stopped at a gastronome on her way home, joining the queue that had formed outside. Word had spread that oranges were available, those exotic southern fruits that appeared irregularly and were treasured when they could be obtained. She waited patiently, eventually purchasing her allocation, just a few, but fresh and precious. Her apartment, small but private, was her sanctuary. She prepared a simple dinner in the tiny kitchen, potatoes, vegetables from the collective farm market where she had shopped on Sunday, a small piece of meat secured through a workplace distribution. The meal was modest but adequate, better than what her parents' generation had often known, reflecting the gradual improvement in living standards that had occurred since Stalin's death. After dinner came leisure time, and for Natasha this meant reading, listening to music, perhaps watching television. The television offered limited programming on state-controlled channels, but certain shows had become cultural touchstones, serial dramas that millions watched, classic films repeated annually, sports broadcasts. The news program Vremya presented carefully curated information emphasizing Soviet achievements and Western failures. Credible to no one, but required viewing for those who wished to appear properly informed. Her record player, a prized possession acquired after considerable searching and expense, allowed access to music ranging from classical performances to officially approved Soviet popular music to bootleg recordings of Western artists. The Beatles' albums recorded onto X-ray films, the sound quality poor but the content treasured, represented a small rebellion, a window onto a world beyond Soviet control. I recall her settling into an armchair with a book borrowed from a friend, a translation of a foreign novel that existed in the gray zone between official approval and outright prohibition. These books circulated through informal networks, passed hand to hand among trusted friends, providing access to literature and ideas that expanded horizons beyond what Soviet publishers provided. This shadow library complemented the shadow economy, creating parallel systems that filled gaps left by official channels. The telephone rang, and a friend invited her to a gathering on Saturday evening. These informal gatherings of friends in private apartments represented some of the most valued aspects of Soviet social life, away from workplace obligations and public spaces. In the intimacy of someone's kitchen or living room, conversations could become more authentic. People could speak more freely, share private opinions, discuss topics that would be risky in public settings. The weekend brought its own rhythms, different from the work week, but still structured by the constraints and opportunities of Soviet life. Saturday remained a workday for many, though discussions about moving to a 5-day work week had been ongoing for years. Sunday offered genuine rest, time for activities beyond obligatory labor. Natasha visited her parents on Sunday, maintaining the family connections that remained strong throughout Soviet life. Her mother had prepared a special meal using ingredients secured through various channels, some from regular shops, others from the collective farm market, a few treasured items from her father's workplace distribution. The family gathering extended through the afternoon, conversation ranging across personal news, shared cultural experiences, carefully expressed observations about contemporary life. The evening brought the gathering she had been invited to, a small group of close friends meeting in someone's apartment. These kitchen table discussions, conducted over tea or vodka, allowed for more honest exchange than was possible in public. People could acknowledge the system's failures, could share frustrations about daily life, could discuss ideas and opinions that diverged from official narratives. These conversations were still conducted cautiously, for wariness remained even among friends, but they provided essential spaces for authentic connection and expression. The week began again on Monday, the cycle of work and modest leisure repeating. This was life in the Brezhnev era, stable, predictable, secure in certain ways, but constrained in others, providing basic necessities but not abundance, offering some cultural richness while restricting creative and political freedom. The system had achieved a kind of equilibrium, neither the chaos and terror of Stalin's time nor the attempted reforms of Khrushchev, but a stagnant stability that delivered enough to prevent widespread unrest while demanding conformity and extracting the price of diminished horizons. I watched Natasha and millions like her navigate this system, finding spaces for personal meaning within collective structures, maintaining dual consciousness that allowed public participation alongside private reservations, building lives that were neither entirely miserable nor fully satisfying, but something in between, bearable, sustainable, characterized more by quiet resignation than either enthusiasm or active opposition. The industrial symphony played on the great machinery of the Soviet state, continuing its operation, producing statistics that suggested growth and achievement while beneath the surface. The inefficiencies accumulated, the technological gap with the West widened, the informal economy grew, the cynicism deepened. But these problems seemed chronic rather than acute, manageable rather than existential. Few imagined that the system that had endured for 6 decades might collapse within another decade and a half. Life continued in its established patterns, and most people focused on navigating daily challenges rather than contemplating systemic transformation. As evening fell across Moscow, as lights came on in countless apartments where families gathered for dinner and their few hours of leisure before sleep, as the metro carried its millions of passengers through underground palaces, as factories continued their 24-hour operations, the Soviet Union seemed permanent, solid, capable of enduring indefinitely despite its flaws. The texture of daily life had become familiar, the adaptations and strategies internalized, the system's demands and rewards understood. Tomorrow would bring another day, much like today, and the day after that, and so on indefinitely into a future that seemed predictable, if not exciting, constrained, if not completely oppressive, a life that millions had learned to live with, if not entirely love. Chapter 9. The Unraveling of Certainties. The winter snow fell softly on Moscow in 1985, and I recall the sense of possibility, of unease, of hope mixed with apprehension that accompanied the ascension of Mikhail Gorbachev to the position of General Secretary of the Communist Party. He was younger than the gerontocracy that had ruled during the Brezhnev years and the brief tenures of his immediate predecessors, Andropov and Chernenko. He spoke of renewal, of reform, of making socialism work as it was supposed to. He introduced words that would become famous: perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. Few understood, as he apparently did not fully understand himself, that these reforms would unleash forces that would ultimately destroy the system they were meant to save. I watched Soviet society begin to change in ways subtle at first, but increasingly dramatic. Gorbachev was a true believer, a Leninist, who thought the Soviet system could be reformed, that introducing elements of market economics while maintaining party control could revitalize the stagnant economy, that allowing more open discussion of problems could generate solutions rather than undermine faith in the system. He was wrong, but the experiment would transform not just the Soviet Union, but the entire world. Perestroika attempted to introduce market mechanisms into the planned economy while maintaining the guiding role of the Communist Party, a circle that could not be squared, a contradiction that could not be resolved. The economic reforms were timid and often contradictory. Enterprises were given more autonomy, but still faced state directives. Private enterprise was cautiously permitted in some sectors, but heavily restricted and taxed. The reforms disrupted the old system's functioning without creating a viable new system to replace it. I remember the growing chaos in the economy as perestroika progressed. Shortages that had always been chronic became acute. Inflation began to erode the stability of Soviet prices, which had been fixed for decades. The informal economy that had operated in the shadows became more visible and more necessary for survival. People who had learned to navigate the old system found the rules changing, creating both opportunities for those who adapted quickly and hardship for those who could not. But it was glasnost that proved truly revolutionary, though Gorbachev did not intend it as such. Allowing more openness in discussing Soviet history and contemporary problems meant that the crimes and failures that everyone knew about but could not acknowledge publicly suddenly became subjects of open conversation. Newspapers began publishing articles that would have been unthinkable years earlier. Television programs aired discussions of problems that had been treated as state secrets. Books that had circulated only in Semistot, illegal typed copies, were published officially. I recall the first time I heard public acknowledgement of the Stalin-era purges, the famine of the 1930s, the true extent of the Gulag. Survivors who had been silent for decades began to tell their stories. Mass graves were excavated and acknowledged. The scale of Soviet crimes against its own population became part of public discourse, rather than whispered knowledge shared only in trusted company. The effect was electric and destabilizing. For Natasha, now in her mid-30s, and for millions of Soviet citizens, the official acknowledgement of truths they had privately known created a crisis of faith. If the party had lied about Stalin, what else had it lied about? If the system had committed such crimes, what legitimacy did it retain? If glasnost revealed such profound failures, how could one continue to believe in the socialist project? The nationalist sentiments that had been suppressed under Soviet rule began to surface. The Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, had been independent countries before being forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940, and their populations had never fully accepted Soviet rule. Now they began demanding autonomy, then independence. Similar movements emerged in other republics. The fiction that the Soviet Union was a voluntary federation of equal partners began to collapse as the partners declared they wished to leave. I watched as the Eastern European satellites that had been held in the Soviet orbit by force began to slip away. Poland's solidarity movement, which had been suppressed in the early 80s, re-emerged and gained power. Hungary opened its borders. The Berlin Wall, that most potent symbol of the Cold War division, fell in November of 1989, and I stood among the crowds, watching Germans from east and west embrace, watching the physical manifestation of Soviet power crumble before cameras that broadcast the images worldwide. These events reverberated through Soviet society. If the Eastern European countries could throw off communist rule, if the Berlin Wall could fall, if the Cold War structures that had seemed permanent for 4 decades could dissolve so quickly, what did this mean for the Soviet Union itself? The sense of inevitability that had surrounded the system, the feeling that despite its problems it would continue indefinitely, began to evaporate. Daily life became increasingly difficult as the economic situation deteriorated. The shortages that had always required patience and connections became severe. Store shelves that had held at least basic goods sat empty. Rationing was introduced for some items. The black market flourished as the official economy faltered. People who had maintained modest but stable lives found themselves struggling. Pensioners on fixed incomes faced genuine hardship as inflation destroyed the value of their savings and benefits. I remember the queues growing longer, the frustration more palpable. The system had always demanded that citizens invest enormous time in obtaining necessities, but there had been a tacit agreement, endured the shortages and inconveniences, and basic security would be maintained. Now even that bargain seemed to be breaking down. People stood in line for hours, only to find that goods had run out. The predictability that had characterized Soviet life, however unsatisfying, was disappearing. Political reforms followed economic ones, though Gorbachev tried to control their pace. The Congress of People's Deputies, elected in 1989 in the first contested elections since the early Soviet period, became a forum for genuine debate rather than rubber stamp approval of party decisions. Deputies rose to criticize the government, to demand accountability, to question the party's monopoly on power. Television broadcasts of these sessions were watched avidly by millions of Soviet citizens who had never before seen officials face real challenges. The August coup of 1991, when hardliners attempted to remove Gorbachev and reverse the reforms, ultimately accelerated the collapse it was meant to prevent. I recall the surreal days when tanks rolled into Moscow, when the coup plotters announced they were saving the country, when Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank outside the Russian parliament and called for resistance. The coup failed, partly because the military was unwilling to fire on crowds, partly because the party structures that were supposed to implement it no longer functioned effectively. In the aftermath, the Soviet Union's days were numbered. The republics that had declared independence before the coup now could not be prevented from leaving. The institutions that had held the Union together had been discredited. Gorbachev, who had initiated the reforms, hoping to strengthen socialism, found himself presiding over its dissolution. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist, replaced by 15 independent countries, the largest of which was Russia. I stood in Red Square that December evening, watching the Soviet flag lowered for the final time from the Kremlin, replaced by the Russian tricolor that had not flown there since the revolution. The emotions were complex and contradictory, relief mixed with apprehension, hope for a better future mixed with mourning for a familiar past, liberation from constraints mixed with fear of uncertainty. For Natasha and her generation, the collapse brought profound disorientation. The system that had shaped every aspect of their lives, that had educated them, employed them, housed them, organized their leisure, and directed their ambitions, was gone. The certainties they had been raised with, the superiority of socialism, the inevitable victory over capitalism, the permanence of Soviet power, had proven illusory. The dual consciousness they had maintained, publicly conforming while privately skeptical, was no longer necessary, but freedom from compelled performance brought new challenges. The decade that followed brought hardships that many had not anticipated. The transition to market economics was chaotic and brutal. State enterprises collapsed, throwing millions out of work in a society that had guaranteed employment. Savings were wiped out by hyperinflation. Pensions became worthless. Crime flourished as social order broke down. Corruption reached levels that shocked even those accustomed to the Soviet system's inefficiencies. The safety net that the Soviet state had provided, however inadequate, disappeared, leaving many vulnerable and desperate. Life expectancy actually declined in Russia during the 1990s, a catastrophic development unprecedented in peacetime for an industrialized nation. Poverty increased dramatically. The inequality that market economics generated seemed especially harsh to a population that had been raised on egalitarian rhetoric, even if practice had fallen short. Some adapted quickly, seizing opportunities in the new system, becoming entrepreneurs, or joining the bureaucracies of the new governments. But many struggled, feeling betrayed and abandoned, nostalgic for the security they had known even if it had come with constraints. I recall conversations in those years where people expressed complex and sometimes contradictory feelings about the Soviet past. They did not want the terror of Stalin's years to return. They did not want the repression and restrictions, but they missed the stability, the sense that basic needs would be met, the community and collective identity that had bound them together. The nostalgia was selective, remembering positive aspects while forgetting or minimizing the negative, but it was real and widespread. Polls conducted in later years revealed that substantial portions of the Russian population preferred the Soviet system to what had replaced it, at least in certain respects. They missed the economic security, the superpower status, the sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. They felt that the promise of democracy and prosperity that had been made during the transition had not been fulfilled, that they had traded one flawed system for another that was different but not clearly better. This nostalgia was particularly strong for the Brezhnev era, the era of stagnation that at the time had seemed frustratingly static, but in retrospect appeared as a golden age of stability. People forgot the shortages and restrictions, or rather, they remembered them, but felt that these had been acceptable prices for the security and predictability that the system had provided. The present difficulties made the past seem better than it had felt when they were living it. A common pattern in human memory that softens hardship and highlights what has been lost. Yet, even as nostalgia grew, few seriously wished for a complete return to the Soviet system. The freedoms that had been gained, freedom to travel abroad, freedom to start businesses, freedom to speak openly without fear of the knock on the door, these were valued even by those who struggled economically. The ability to criticize the government without being arrested, to practice religion openly, to access information from beyond state-controlled media, these represented genuine liberation that most did not wish to surrender. I watched as Russia and the other former Soviet republics struggled to build new identities, new systems, new relationships with each other and with the world. Some republics experienced violent conflicts as ethnic tensions suppressed during the Soviet period erupted. Chechnya, Nagorno-Karabakh, Transnistria, these regions became sites of warfare that claimed thousands of lives. The peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union that had seemed miraculous in December of 1991 was followed by years of violence in various post-Soviet territories. The legacy of the Soviet Union remained visible everywhere. The apartment blocks where people lived had been built during Soviet times. The infrastructure, the metro systems, the power plants, the roads and railways was Soviet-built and aging without adequate maintenance or replacement. The educational system retained many Soviet structures and methods. The mentality shaped by decades of Soviet life, the skepticism of authority, the reliance on personal connections, the gap between public performance and private truth persisted even as the system that had created it disappeared. Natasha, navigating her 40s in the new Russia, found employment in a private company after her state research facility closed. The work was more dynamic but less secure. Her salary fluctuated with the economy, sometimes comfortable, sometimes barely adequate. Her pension, which she had expected to provide security in old age, had been destroyed by inflation and would clearly be insufficient. She adapted, as millions did, learning new skills, accepting new uncertainties, making peace with a reality that was neither what she had been promised during her Soviet youth nor what she had hoped for when the system collapsed. The physical spaces of Soviet life gradually transformed. The statue of Lenin that had stood in every town square began to come down in many places, though not all. Some were moved to parks where Soviet-era monuments were collected, strange graveyards of a vanished state. Others remained, partly from inertia, partly from continuing respect for Lenin, if not for what the system became, partly because removing them required effort and expense that cash-strapped local governments could not afford. The propaganda that had covered every surface, the billboards proclaiming socialist achievements, the banners with party slogans, the posters of heroic workers, was replaced by advertising for Western goods announcements of new products and services, the visual language of capitalism. The transformation was jarring for those who had known only the Soviet aesthetic, a reminder that the world they had inhabited for their entire lives had truly ended. I recall walking through Moscow in the late 90s and seeing the mixture of old and new, Soviet remnants and post-Soviet additions, past and present, colliding in architecture and daily life. A McDonald's restaurant operating in a building that had once housed a Soviet cafeteria. Designer boutiques in spaces that had been state shops. The jarring sight of homeless people on streets where such visible poverty had not existed in Soviet times, when everyone at least had basic housing, even if it was a communal apartment. The cultural life that had been tightly controlled but also subsidized and accessible began to change. Theaters and concert halls that had offered classical culture at affordable prices now faced financial pressures and raised prices, making high culture less accessible to ordinary citizens. At the same time, previously banned or restricted works became available. Western films flooded into theaters. Books that had circulated only in samizdat could now be published and purchased freely. The cultural landscape expanded dramatically, even as its economic support diminished. Religion, which had been suppressed and driven underground during much of the Soviet period, experienced a revival. Churches that had been closed or converted to other uses were restored and reopened. Monasteries that had survived in remote locations saw renewed interest. Many Russians, even those who had grown up in atheist families, began exploring Orthodox Christianity, seeking meaning and community in tradition that had been denied to their parents' generation. The spiritual vacuum left by the collapse of communist ideology was being filled, though not always in ways that the newly democratic state found comfortable. The education system faced crises as funding collapsed and teachers went unpaid for months. The universal literacy and mathematical rigor that had been Soviet achievements were threatened as schools struggled to function. Yet children continued to be educated, though the curriculum was revised to remove the most obvious ideological content, to present Russian history more honestly, to acknowledge the Soviet period's crimes alongside its achievements. For the generation that came of age after the collapse, Soviet life was history rather than memory. They knew it through their parents' stories, through the physical remnants that surrounded them, through the cultural references that persisted, but they had not lived the contradictions, had not developed the dual consciousness, had not learned the strategies of survival in a system that was simultaneously providing and constraining. They were building new identities as Russians or Ukrainians or Kazakhs or citizens of the other new nations, though the Soviet experience shaped their societies even in its absence. I have lived long enough to see that the Soviet experiment was both grand and terrible, achieving genuine accomplishments while committing enormous crimes, providing security to millions while crushing the human spirit, creating a superpower that could launch satellites and produce world-class scientists while maintaining a system so inefficient it could not adequately feed or clothe its people. The truth about the Soviet Union cannot be reduced to simple formulas, cannot be dismissed entirely as a failed totalitarian nightmare, nor celebrated uncritically as a worker's paradise. It was something more complex, more human in its mixture of aspiration and failure, idealism and cynicism, achievement and catastrophe. The daily life that I have tried to illuminate for you across these hours, the communal apartments and kitchen conversations, the factory work and collective farms, the education and propaganda, the fear and adaptation, the shortages and informal economies, the public performances and private truths. This was how hundreds of millions of people lived for 7 decades. They were not abstract ideological types, but human beings navigating circumstances they did not choose, making lives within constraints they could not fully escape, finding moments of joy and connection despite systemic failures, surviving and sometimes even flourishing in a society that was attempting something unprecedented in human history and failing in ways both predictable and surprising. The collapse brought liberation for some, catastrophe for others, and for most, a mixture of both. The post-Soviet world has brought its own challenges, its own failures and achievements, its own forms of constraint and possibility. Whether what replaced the Soviet Union is better or worse depends on whom you ask, on what aspects of life you consider most important, on what you believe human beings need to flourish. The debate continues, inflected by nostalgia and selective memory, by current struggles that shape how the past is viewed, by the eternal human tendency to imagine that some other time or place might have been better than wherever and whenever we find ourselves. Chapter 10. The echo that remains. The snow falls gently this evening in Moscow, and I stand once more in Red Square watching. The lights illuminate the Kremlin walls, as they have for centuries, first under czars, then under general secretaries, now under a Russian government that claims to be something different, yet carries within it the weight of all that came before. The Soviet Union has been gone for more than 3 decades now, longer than the entire life span of many who live in the successor states. Yet its presence haunts these lands like a ghost that refuses to disperse, like a dream from which one has awakened, but whose emotional residue persists into the day. I have taken you on this long journey through Soviet life because I believe that to understand our present world, one must understand this vanished society that shaped the 20th century so profoundly, the Cold War that dominated global politics, the space race that carried humans beyond Earth, the ideological conflict that divided nations and families, the nuclear arsenal that threatened human existence itself. All of these emerged from or were shaped by the Soviet experiment. And beyond these grand historical forces, there were the millions of individual lives lived within this system, the daily textures of existence that I have tried to illuminate through these hours of recollection. What then should you remember from this journey? What truths persist when the snow of time has covered the specific details, when the names and dates fade, but the essential understanding remains? Remember first that the Soviet Union was built upon genuine idealism, upon a desire to create a more just society where exploitation would end and abundance would be shared equally. The revolution was not merely a power grab, though it became that. It began with dreams of liberation, with a vision of human potential unconstrained by class hierarchy, with the promise that ordinary workers and peasants could build a civilization superior to any that had existed before. This idealism was real, believed sincerely by millions who sacrificed for the cause, who endured hardship in the conviction that they were building a better future for their children. But remember also that this idealism, however genuine, led to catastrophe when it encountered the complexities of human nature and social organization. The attempt to remake society through coercion rather than consent to plan comprehensively what emerges better from decentralized decision-making, to eliminate private interest in favor of collective identity. These efforts produced not paradise, but a system that murdered millions, impoverished those it claimed to liberate, and ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Remember the communal apartments, where families shared bathrooms and learned the strategies of survival in crowded intimacy, where privacy was a luxury almost unknown and daily life required constant negotiation with neighbors who might be friends or informers. These spaces represented both the egalitarianism of the revolution. The wealthy had been dispossessed, their grand apartments redistributed to workers, and the poverty of its achievements after decades of socialist construction. Millions still lived in conditions that violated basic human dignity. Remember the factories where workers operated machinery that should have been replaced, met quotas through improvisation and creative accounting, participated in a planned economy that was simultaneously impressive in its scale and dysfunctional in its details. The Soviet Union did transform itself from an agricultural backwater into an industrial power, did produce scientists and engineers of genuine brilliance, did achieve technological feats that amazed the world. But it did so at enormous human cost, through forced mobilization of resources, through exploitation of the countryside to fund urban industry, through a system that rewarded quantity over quality and punished innovation as dangerous deviation. Remember the collective farms where peasants worked land that was nominally theirs collectively but actually controlled by the state, where the most productive plots were the tiny private gardens that families tended in their spare time, where the dysfunction of socialist agriculture condemned millions to unnecessary hunger and left the nation dependent on grain imports from ideological enemies. The violence of collectivization, the famine it produced, the generations of rural poverty it perpetuated. These represent some of the Soviet system's gravest crimes, less remembered than the purges, but equally devastating in their human cost. Remember the terror, the knock on the door at midnight, the arrests for crimes that were invented or imagined, the gulag camps, where millions labored and died in service of economic goals that could have been achieved more efficiently through free labor. Remember that this terror was not merely Stalin's personal cruelty, but emerged from the system's logic, from the need to find enemies to justify continued revolutionary vigilance, from the impossibility of acknowledging failure in a system that claimed scientific certainty about its path. Remember, too, that unlike the Nazi terror that targeted specific groups, Soviet terror could strike anyone, creating a paranoia so pervasive that it poisoned even the relationships between those who believed most fervently in the cause. Remember the education system that achieved universal literacy, that produced technically competent professionals, that made culture accessible to ordinary citizens, but that also indoctrinated children in ideology from their earliest years, that suppressed critical thinking in favor of rote learning, that taught versions of history that were often lies. Remember the pioneer ceremonies and Komsomol meetings, the red scarves and solemn oaths, the children shaped by a system that sought to mold them into new Soviet people but produced instead generations with dual consciousness capable of public performance while maintaining private skepticism. Remember the shortages and queues, the endless lines to purchase basic goods, the time wasted that represented an invisible tax on everyone's life, the informal networks of blat that were necessary to obtain what should have been readily available, the black markets that flourished in the shadows of the planned economy. Remember that the system which promised abundance delivered chronic scarcity, which claimed efficiency operated with enormous waste, which preached equality created new forms of privilege for those who controlled access to resources. Remember to the achievements that cannot be denied even as we acknowledge the failures, the metro stations that were palaces for the people, the classical music and ballet accessible to workers, the space program that put the first satellite and first human into orbit, the victory over Nazi Germany that came at the cost of 27 million Soviet lives but saved the world from an even more terrible tyranny. Remember that Soviet citizens took pride in these achievements, that they were not merely propaganda but represented real accomplishments that gave meaning to lives that were often hard and constrained. Remember the resilience and adaptability of ordinary people who found ways to survive and sometimes flourish within a difficult system, who maintained humanity in dehumanizing circumstances, who created spaces for authentic connection within a society that demanded constant societal performance of loyalty. Remember the kitchen table conversations where truth could be spoken among trusted friends, the private sphere that persisted despite the system's attempts to make everything collective, the small kindnesses and mutual aid that sustained communities through hardship. Remember the collapse, how a system that seemed permanent dissolved with shocking rapidity, how the certainties that had shaped lives for decades evaporated, how the liberation from constraints brought new hardships that made many nostalgic for what they had lost. Remember that the post-Soviet world has brought both freedom and chaos, both opportunity and insecurity, both honest acknowledgement of the past and selective memory that romanticizes it. What lessons should we draw from this history? Perhaps first, that grand schemes to remake human nature through coercion will always fail, that societies function better when they accommodate human complexity rather than trying to eliminate it, that freedom, with all its attendant risks and inequalities, is preferable to security purchased through submission. Perhaps we should learn that idealism without respect for human rights becomes tyranny, that ends do not justify means, that the path to hell is indeed paved with good intentions when those intentions are pursued without limits or accountability. But we should also remember that the problems the Soviet Union tried to solve, inequality, exploitation, the vulnerability of individuals before powerful economic forces, these problems remain real, even if the Soviet solution proved catastrophic. We should not conclude from Soviet failure that all attempts to create more just societies are doomed, that all critique of capitalism is naive, that the only alternative to central planning is unfettered markets. The challenge is to find ways to address genuine social problems without the authoritarianism that destroyed the Soviet experiment. As I stand here in the cold Moscow night, I think of all the lives that unfolded within the Soviet system across those 7 decades. I think of the children born into communal apartments who never knew privacy, of the peasants collectivized by force who watched their way of life destroyed, of the factory workers who built impressive machinery with inadequate tools, of the students educated rigorously but taught lies about history, of the scientists who achieved brilliance despite constraints, of the artists who created beauty within narrow ideological bounds, of the millions who simply tried to live decent lives, to love their families, to find meaning and connection, to survive with dignity intact. Most were neither heroes nor villains, but ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances, making compromises that seemed necessary, finding moments of joy amid constraint, hoping that the sacrifices demanded of them would create a better future even when evidence suggested otherwise. They deserve to be remembered not as abstractions in ideological debates, but as human beings whose lives mattered, whose struggles and achievements formed the texture of a vanished world that shaped our own. The Soviet Union's legacy lives on in the infrastructure it built, the nuclear weapons it created, the cultural references that persist, the trauma passed down through generations, the nostalgia that colors memory, the inequalities of the post-Soviet world that make some long for Soviet security, even knowing its cost. It lives on in the ways that Russians and Ukrainians and Georgians and all the other former Soviet peoples understand themselves and each other in the suspicion of the West that Cold War confrontation bred, in the architecture that dots the landscape, in the mentality shaped by decades of adaptation to a system that was both provider and prison. And it lives on in the lessons we can draw if we are willing to look honestly at this history. That human beings need freedom to flourish, but also security and community. That markets are better at distributing resources than central planning, but also produce inequalities that societies must address. That critique of existing systems is necessary and healthy, but revolutionary transformation often produces outcomes worse than what it replaces. That idealism matters, but must be tempered by respect for human rights and acknowledgement of human complexity. That the small acts of kindness and connection that people practice daily matter more than grand ideological visions. That history is made by ordinary people living ordinary lives as much as by leaders making world historical decisions. And thus ends another memory from ages long past. If you have found a spark of wonder here, stay a while longer, for there are countless tales yet to be remembered.